Tonight, we're diving into a strange and gentle dream of the desert. The story of a man who reached the very edge of death and prophecy, and who woke instead as a small child at the beginning of his own life, carrying every memory of all that was to come. Imagine Paul Atreides at the threshold where vision and ending blur into one, and imagine that, instead of passing on, he opened his eyes as a boy in the green halls of Castle Caladan, with his mother and father alive, the sea sighing beyond the walls, and the whole long tragedy of Arrakis folded quietly inside him, known in advance. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow him without haste through a second childhood, through the training taken twice, through a trap he already sees coming, and through a desert that he knows down to the last grain of sand. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down towards sleep. There is a place in the deep desert of Arrakis where death and vision become the same soft country, and it was there, at the still luminous edge of the water of life, that Paul Atreides found himself suspended between one breath and the next. The sacred poison had opened him the way a key opens a door that was never truly locked, only forgotten. And in that opening, the whole of time lay spread before him like a slow tide across an endless shore. He had been the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could be many places at once, the mind that bridged space and remembrance. Now he hung at the threshold, and the desert around him was neither hot nor cold, only quiet, the way the world is quiet in the last moment before sleep takes a tired child. He had lived a life already. He knew this the way one knows the weight of one's own hands. He had crossed the sand and ridden the great worms, had loved and lost, had watched a green banner rise across the stars, carrying his name into places he had never wished it to go. He had felt the weight of empire settle on his shoulders like wet cloth, heavy and cold and impossible to set down. And now, at the border of the water of life, all of that gathered itself into a single shimmering point, and the point offered him something that prescience had never offered before. It offered him a return. The vision did not speak, for visions do not speak, but it showed him a shape, and the shape was small. It was the shape of a boy. It was the shape of a beginning. He understood, in the wordless way that the deep spice teaches, that the tide could carry him backward as easily as forward, that the same fold of time which let him see the future could, at this one still moment, let him step into the past and wear it again like a garment he had outgrown once and might now grow into differently. He felt no fear at this. He felt instead the enormous tenderness of a man being given a second chance he had never dared to ask for, and had never believed such things were possible. And so he let the luminous stillness take him. He did not fight the tide. He gave himself to it the way the desert gives itself to the wind, and the point of light widened and softened and became a room, and the room became a memory, and the memory became real. He woke as a small child in Castle Caladan. The first thing he knew was the sound of the sea. The great gray-green ocean of Caladan breathed against the cliffs below the castle, a vast and patient sound, older than any house or throne, and it filled the little room where he lay. He was warm. He was wrapped in soft cloth. His body was tiny, and it did not answer him the way a grown body answers, for his arms were the short, soft arms of a boy who had not yet learned to run, and his hands could not yet grip a blade. Yet inside that small frame lived the whole ocean of his memory, deep and cold and luminous, the mind of a man who had seen the end of 100 roads. The strangeness of it settled over him slowly, the way morning light settles over water. He was Paul Atreides, and he was newly born again into the same name, the same blood, the same green world. He remembered dying, or nearly dying, at the far edge of a desert that did not yet exist for this small body, on a planet he had not yet been sent to, in a war that had not yet been dreamed. And here, now, that desert was only a word in an old man's memory carried inside a child's chest. He heard footsteps beyond the door, soft and unhurried, and he knew them before the door opened. He knew the rhythm of them, the particular patience of them. His mother was coming, Lady Jessica of the Bene Gesserit, tall and calm and watchful, moved through the corridors of Castle Caladan with the quiet that her training had given her, and when she came into the little room and bent over him, Paul looked up into her face and felt something break gently open inside the deep, cold ocean of his mind. She was alive. She was young. Her eyes had not yet learned the grief he remembered in them. She had not yet crossed the sand, had not yet drunk the sacred water, had not yet become the sorrowing reverend mother of a hard new world. She was only his mother, bending over her infant son in a quiet room above the sea, and she did not know that the eyes looking back at her had already watched her weep at the far end of a life not yet lived. He wanted, in that first moment, to tell her everything. The impulse rose in him like a wave, but he was wise with the weight of one whole life already spent, and he understood that a child who spoke of the future would be a child who frightened the people who loved him, and a frightened house is a careless house, and carelessness is the mother of every disaster he remembered. So, he did the first difficult thing of his second life. He kept silent. He let his face be a child's face. He let his eyes be soft and unknowing, and he received his mother's love the way an infant receives it, wholly and without words, even as the ocean of his memory turned slowly beneath the surface. There was another presence in the castle, and he felt it the way one feels the sun through a closed shutter. His father lived. Duke Leto Atreides, the just and careful lord of House Atreides, moved somewhere in the great stone halls, alive and unwounded, his heart still whole, his fate still unwritten. Paul had watched that man die once. He had carried the memory of it like a stone sewn into the lining of his soul. And now, impossibly, the stone had been lifted, and his father breathed the same salt air that he breathed, under the same roof, on the same green and gentle world. The knowledge was almost too much for so small a body to hold. It gathered in him like water rising behind a dam, the enormous soft flood of a future he alone remembered, and he lay very still and let it rise and did not break beneath it. For he understood already, in the first hour of his second childhood, that he had been given something no seer before him had ever been given. He had been given not only the sight of what would come, but the chance to stand between it and the people he loved. Every death he remembered was now a death that had not yet happened. Every betrayal was a seed not yet planted. Every grief lay ahead of him on the road, and this time he would walk that road, knowing exactly where each shadow fell. He closed his small eyes and listened to the sea. The great patient ocean of Caladan breathed against the cliffs, in and out, the oldest lullaby in the world, and the child, who was also an old man, let himself be rocked by it. There would be time. That was the strangest gift of all, and the sweetest. There would be time to learn again, time to grow again, time to plan against the sorrows he could see waiting far out on the sand. Tonight there was only the warm room, the soft cloth, the breathing sea, and a mother's hand resting lightly upon a small chest that held a whole hidden ocean. And so, held between memory and morning, Paul Atreides slept, and his sleep was the first true rest he had known in the long, luminous country beyond time. Up next in Chapter 2, The Child Who Remembered the Future will follow Paul through the tender strangeness of a second childhood as he learns patience, hides the depth of what he knows, and carries the weight of a tomorrow that only he can remember. The days of Caladan came to the child slowly, one after another, like waves arriving on a long and gentle shore. And Paul Atreides received them with a patience that no true child could ever have possessed. For inside the small growing body lived the whole memory of a man who had already crossed the desert of his years, and that memory made every ordinary morning into something strange and precious. He would wake in the gray sea light of the castle, and for a moment he would not know which life he was waking into, the first or the second, and then the sound of the ocean would remind him, and he would remember that he had been given the gift of beginning again. A second childhood with a whole mind inside it is a curious and lonely country. Paul learned this in the earliest of his young years, before he could walk without stumbling, before his tongue could shape the words that his mind already held in abundance. He knew the names of stars that his small eyes had not yet been taught to find. He knew the shape of a betrayal that lay many years ahead. He knew the taste of spice and the roar of a great worm rising from the sand, though this green ocean world had never known such things, and never would. And he could tell none of it, for there was no one who could hold such knowledge safely, and so he held it alone, gently, the way one carries a sleeping bird cupped in both hands. The hardest lesson of that early time was patience, and it was a lesson he had to teach himself. A grown mind wishes to act. It sees a danger far off, and it strains toward it, longing to move, to speak, to change the shape of what is coming. But Paul was bound inside the slow, soft growth of a small body, and he could not run to meet the future, and even if he could have run, he had learned in his first life that the future is not moved by haste. It is moved by understanding, by timing, by the quiet placing of one small thing against another until the whole vast weight of events begins, almost imperceptibly, to lean a different way. So he practiced stillness. He let himself be a child in all the outward ways, and he let his great knowledge sink down deep beneath the surface, the way the deepest water lies untroubled beneath the storms that cross the top of the sea. He learned to hide the depth of what he knew, and this was a delicate art, for he was surrounded by watchful people who loved him, his mother most of all. Lady Jessica had been trained by the Bene Gesserit in the reading of the smallest signs, the flicker of an eye, the catch of a breath, the tiny truths the body tells without meaning to. Paul remembered that training, for she had given much of it to him in his first life. And now he found himself using the pupil's knowledge to keep secrets from the teacher. When his understanding rose too near the surface, when some memory of grief or glory threatened to show in his small face, he had learned to let it pass through him like weather, to soften his eyes and loosen his hands and become, for that moment, only a boy watching the rain against the tall windows. Yet he did not wish to deceive his mother out of coldness. He loved her more, if anything, than he had loved her the first time, for now he knew what she would one day suffer, and knowing it made her present peace unbearably sweet to him. He would watch her move through the halls, calm and certain, and he would think of the hard woman she had once become out on the sand, and he would feel a tenderness so large it frightened him. He wanted to spare her. He wanted to spare all of them. And that wanting was the true weight he carried, heavier than any prescient vision, for a vision only shows what will be, while love demands that one try to change it. There were moments when the two lives folded so close together that he could scarcely tell them apart. He would be sitting on the cool stone floor of a sunlit room, a wooden toy in his small hands, and suddenly the sunlight would seem to be the light of another sun, and the toy would seem to be a weapon, and the quiet room would seem to be the mouth of a cave far away in a land of sand. Then the fold of time would smooth itself out again, and he would be a child once more, and the toy would be only a toy. He came to understand that this doubling would be his companion for all his days, that he would always live twice at once, one life laid gently over the other like two thin sheets of glass through which a single flame is seen. He grew, as children grow, and with each season his body came a little more under his command. He learned to walk, and his walking was steadier than a child's ought to be. So he taught himself to stumble now and then, to fall in the soft, harmless way of the very young, so that no one would wonder at his grace. He learned to speak, and his first words were the ordinary sweet words that please a mother's heart, though behind them waited a whole language of thought he dared not use. Every day was a small performance of ordinariness, and every night, when the castle grew quiet and the sea took up its patient song beneath the cliffs, he would let the performance fall away and lie awake in the dark, turning the great slow wheel of his memory, studying the future the way a general studies a map before a battle he means to win. For he had begun, even then, to think of it as a battle, though a gentle one. He knew what was coming. He knew that far away, in the halls of an emperor he had not yet met, a gift was being prepared that was also a trap. He knew the name of the world that would be offered to his house, and the name of the enemy who waited there in the dark beneath the sand. He knew which faces around him would stay true, and which one, through no true fault of its own, would break. All of this lay ahead, years ahead, and he was only a small boy on a green world by the sea. But time was on his side now, for the first time in either of his lives. He had years to grow, years to learn, years to prepare. And a mind that knows exactly where the storm will fall can do a great deal, quietly, before the first cloud ever darkens the sky. So the child who remembered the future learned to be patient, and to be gentle, and to be watchful, and above all to wait. He let himself be loved. He let himself be small. He let the great ocean of Caladan rock him to sleep each night with its oldest and most patient song, and he gathered his strength the way the desert gathers water, slowly, secretly, against a day of need that only he could see coming. And in the deep quiet of those early years, beneath the soft face of an ordinary boy, a plan began to take shape, the way a shape forms in still water when something vast moves far below. Up next, in Chapter 3, Caladan Before the Fall, we'll walk the green halls of House Atreides in the last untroubled years, among the faces Paul loved and once watched die, and feel the aching sweetness of a boyhood relived on a world that does not yet know its own tomorrow. Caladan in those years was a world of water and green, and to the boy who remembered its ending, it was the most beautiful place in all the universe. The great ocean wrapped the planet in a soft gray mantle, and above the sea the skies were often heavy with rain, and the rain fell on the old stone of Castle Atreides and ran down the tall windows in long shining threads. Paul came to love that rain with a love that had grief hidden inside it, for he knew that one day he would leave this world of water for a world of sand, and he knew that the leaving would be the beginning of the fall. So he drank in the wet green mornings, the way a traveler drinks at a well before a long dry road, storing them deep inside himself against the thirst to come. The castle itself was a place of long corridors and high halls, of banners and old stone, of the quiet order that House Atreides had built across many generations. Paul walked its rooms as a boy walks the rooms of his home, and yet each room held a double meaning for him, for he had walked them before in memory and would never quite walk them as an ordinary child again. Here was the great hall where his father held court. Here was the training room where blades would ring. Here was the high window where one could stand and watch the fishing boats come in across the gray water at evening, small and brave against the vastness of the sea. He loved it all, and he loved it the more for knowing how brief its peace would be. His father was the heart of that world. Duke Leto Atreides was a tall man of grave and gentle bearing, a lord who ruled by loyalty rather than by fear, who understood that the love of one's people is a stronger fortress than any wall of stone. Paul would watch him hold court, watch him listen to the troubles of fishermen and farmers and soldiers, watch him weigh each matter with the same unhurried care, whether the speaker was great or small. And Paul's heart would ache with pride and with sorrow together. For he remembered a stone room far away, and a terrible stillness, and the end of this good man. And he carried that memory, folded small and hidden, while he watched his father live. Every day that Leto drew breath was a day Paul counted like a coin of great price, and every kindness of his father's was a thing he pressed into his memory to keep. His mother moved through those halls with her own quiet strength. Lady Jessica was of the Bene Gesserit, and though she had set aside much of the sisterhood's cold ambition for the love of her duke, she carried still the deep training of that ancient order, the control of body and voice and mind that the sisters spent lifetimes perfecting. Paul watched her and learned from watching, and loved her with the fierce protective love of one who knows exactly what the future means to take from her. She had borne him out of love and against the wishes of her order, and he knew the secret of that choice, and he treasured it. Between mother and son there grew a bond of watchfulness, each of them careful, each of them holding depths, though only one of them knew how deep the other's depths truly ran. And there were the men of the household, the strong good men who had shaped his first life and who now shaped his second. There was Gurney Halleck, the warrior with the scarred face and the baliset, who could sing an old tune with tears in his eyes 1 hour and teach the killing art with cold precision the next. Paul loved Gurney with a boy's whole heart, and he remembered the long road he and Gurney would one day walk, the loss and the reunion and the hard years between, and he treasured these early days when Gurney was only his teacher and his friend and had not yet been marked by sorrow. There was Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, quick and bright and loyal, whose skill with a blade was matched only by the warmth of his loyalty. Paul had seen Duncan die once, had seen him give his life so that others might live. And now he watched the same man laugh in the sunlit training room, alive and whole, and the sight was almost more than a small heart could bear. Duncan treated the boy as a friend as much as a charge, and Paul soaked up that friendship and hid the grief that lay beneath it, for the future had not yet claimed any of these good men, and he meant, if it lay within his power, to see that it claimed as few of them as he could manage. And there was Thufir Hawat, the Mentat, the master of assassins and the keeper of the house's strategies, an old man whose mind was a living machine of calculation and whose loyalty to House Atreides ran deeper than the sea. Paul watched Thufir think, watched the old Mentat weigh and sift and plan. And Paul knew that he would one day need every art the old man could teach him, for the enemies of his house did not fight with blades alone. They fought with plots, with patience, with treachery wrapped inside kindness, and against such weapons a boy would need a mind as sharp and cold as Thufir's own. So Paul lived his boyhood among these people, and he watched them, and he loved them, and he grieved for them in advance, and none of them knew. To them he was a bright and gentle child, unusually thoughtful, unusually calm. A boy who seemed sometimes to be listening to a music that no one else could hear. They did not know that the music he listened to was the low, steady sound of the future, rolling toward them all like a tide that had not yet turned. They did not know that when he looked at them with his large, quiet eyes, he was memorizing them, holding them, loving them against a day of loss that he alone could see approaching across the years. The world went on in its green, untroubled way. The fishing boats went out and came in. The rain fell and cleared and fell again. The seasons turned over the gray ocean, and the old castle stood on its cliff as it had stood for generations. And House Atreides governed its water world with justice and with care, unaware that far off in the halls of power its name had already been chosen for a terrible honor. Paul carried that knowledge alone, and he did not let it darken the days. Instead, he let the days be sweet. He let himself be a boy on Caladan, running in the wet grass, listening to Gurney's songs, watching his father hold court, resting his head against his mother's shoulder in the long gray evenings while the sea breathed below. For he had learned, in the long luminous country beyond time, that the future cannot be met with fear. It can only be met with love and with readiness and with the quiet gathering of strength. And so he gathered his strength in the happiest way a boy can gather it, by being happy, by being loved, by drinking deep of a peace he knew would not last. Caladan before the fall was a green and gentle dream, and Paul lived inside that dream with open eyes, cherishing every hour of it, knowing that it was a dream, and loving it all the more for that knowing. Up next, in Chapter 4, The Training Taken Twice, we'll follow Paul into the training rooms of Castle Caladan, where a boy with a master's memory takes up the disciplines of Mentat and Bene Gesserit and Blade a second time, and learns them faster and deeper than any teacher could believe. When a boy who is also a master takes up his lessons a second time, the ordinary shape of learning is turned inside out, and this was the quiet wonder of Paul Atreides in the training years of his second childhood. For the arts that House Atreides taught its heir were arts that Paul had already mastered once, in a life that ended at the edge of the deep desert, and now he came to them again with a curious double knowledge. He knew where each road of learning led, for he had walked every road before. And so the training that takes most students a decade of struggle came to him like water returning to a channel it had carved long ago, swift and sure and deep. Yet he could not show the full speed of his learning, and this was its own kind of discipline. A boy who mastered the killing arts in a single afternoon would frighten his teachers and draw questions he did not wish to answer. So, Paul learned to learn slowly on the surface while learning swiftly underneath, to let his hands remember their old skill a little at a time, to fail on purpose so that his successes would seem earned. It was a patient deception, and it cost him something, for a part of him longed simply to be as good as he already was. But he had learned in his first life that patience is the truest weapon of all, and he practiced it now upon himself with the same care he practiced upon his blade. The first of the great disciplines was the way of the Mentat, and old Thufir Hawat was its keeper. To be a Mentat is to make of one's own mind a living instrument of computation, to gather facts as a spider gathers the threads of its web, and to weave from them the shape of what is hidden and what is coming. Thufir taught the boy the deep habits of the Mentat mind, the ordering of data, the stripping away of feeling from fact, the cold, clear seeing of things as they truly are. Paul took to it as though he had been born to it, which in a sense he had, for he had worn the mentat discipline once before. He learned to let his mind fall into the deep computing trance. And there, in that clear, cold place, he could lay the whole vast board of his knowledge before him and study it as a master studies a game already half played. The second discipline was the way of the Bene Gesserit, and this his mother gave him, though she gave it against the ancient rules of her order, for such training was meant for the daughters of the sisterhood and not for sons. Lady Jessica taught her boy the prana bindu, the perfect control of nerve and muscle that let a trained body move with a precision and a speed that seemed to ordinary eyes like something close to sorcery. She taught him the mastery of pain and fear, the stilling of the frightened animal that lives in every body. She taught him to observe, to read the small truths written in the faces and bodies of others, to know a lie by the tremor that betrays it. And Paul, who had learned all this once at her side in another life, learned it again now with a swiftness that made her wonder, quietly, whether she had bred a son of unusual gift or something stranger still. She taught him, too, the beginnings of the deep control, the discipline that let a sister govern even the workings of her own body from within, the mastery over breath and blood, and the secret chemistry of the flesh. These were the highest arts, and she gave them to him carefully, and he received them carefully, and neither of them spoke of how far his understanding truly ran. For Paul knew where these arts would one day lead him. He knew of a sacred water in a far desert that would open his mind to the whole of time, and he knew that only the deepest Bene Gesserit control would let a body survive that terrible transformation. So he learned his mother's arts not as a game, but as a preparation, storing each lesson away against the trials he could see waiting far ahead on the sand. Then there were the blades, and the men who taught them. Gurney Halleck taught the boy the hard practical art of war, the shield fighter's slow and patient blade, the reading of an opponent, the discipline of the body under stress. Gurney was a stern teacher and a loving one, and he pressed the boy hard, and Paul let himself be pressed, and slowly, session by session, he let his old mastery show itself in the guise of a quick pupil's progress. There is a lesson that Gurney would speak of often, the lesson that mood is a thing for cattle and for love, and not for the fighting of battles. That a warrior must be ready in the moment, whether he feels ready or not. Paul had lived that lesson in his bones, and now he practiced it again, and the practicing made it deeper still. Duncan Idaho taught the boy the swordmaster's quicker art, the bright and dancing blade, the swift footwork, the joy that a great fighter takes in the pure motion of the craft. With Duncan, the training rooms rang with the clash of practice blades and the sound of the swordmaster's laughter, for Duncan taught with a lightness that Gurney did not have, and Paul loved these lessons for the friendship in them, as much as for the skill. And always, beneath the joy, ran the deep current of Paul's remembering, the knowledge of what this bright, loyal man would one day give, and the quiet resolve to be worthy of it, and if the future could be bent, to spare him. There was the weirding way as well, the strange, swift fighting art that the Bene Gesserit knew, a way of moving faster than the eye could follow, of turning the body itself into a weapon beyond the reach of ordinary defense. This his mother began to show him, and this too he took up with a speed that had to be hidden, for he had used the weirding way once across the sands of a distant world, and his body remembered its secrets even when his teachers thought they were placing them there for the first time. So the disciplines gathered in him, one upon another, mentat and Bene Gesserit and blade, the cold, clear mind, and the perfect body and the ready hand. And because he took them all a second time, they settled into him more deeply than they ever could in a single life, root over root, until the arts were not things he did, but things he was. He grew, through those training years, into a boy of quiet and unsettling excellence, a boy whose teachers spoke of him in low, wondering tones, a boy who seemed always to know a little more than he had been taught. And he wore that excellence lightly, and he hid its true depth, and he bent it always toward a single purpose that no one around him could yet see. For all his learning had a shape, and the shape was the future. Every discipline he mastered was a tool he would need for the work that lay ahead, the delicate and dangerous work of standing between the people he loved and the disaster he alone remembered. He was making himself ready. He was forging himself, patiently, in the quiet green years of Caladan, into the one instrument fine enough to change the course of what was coming. And as the training years passed, and his skill deepened beneath its gentle mask, Paul began at last to turn his clear, cold mentat sight toward the thing he had been preparing for all along, the trap that waited in the years ahead, the gift that was also a snare, the betrayal that had not yet been set in motion. Up next in Chapter 5, The Trap He Already Sees, we'll watch Paul turn his foreknowledge toward the coming danger, as he recognizes the Emperor's fateful gift of Arrakis and the ambush hidden within it, and begins, quietly and carefully, to plan against a betrayal that no one else can yet imagine. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a boy who knows how a story ends. It is not the quiet of ignorance, and it is not the quiet of fear. It is the quiet of a traveler who has walked a road once already and now walks it a second time, watching the same trees pass, knowing which of them will fall. In the years of his second boyhood on Caladan, Paul Atreides carried this quiet inside him, like water carried in a sealed skin, precious and hidden, and he did not spill a drop of it where anyone might see. For he already saw the trap. He saw it the way a man standing on a high cliff sees the shape of the whole valley below, the river and the road and the small figures moving along it, unaware of the pattern they made together. The gift of Arrakis was coming. He knew this with a certainty that lived deeper than thought, older than reason. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, seated far away upon the Golden Lion throne, would one day offer House Atreides the stewardship of the desert planet, the only source of the spice melange in all the known universe. It would arrive dressed as an honor. It would arrive as a poisoned cup, lifted with a gracious smile. Paul knew the true shape of it. The Emperor feared his father. Duke Leto the Just had grown too beloved among the great houses of the Landsraad, too admired, too clean of hand in a universe that trusted no one who was clean. A ruler who commands love commands something an emperor cannot tax and cannot seize, and so the Emperor had decided, in the cold arithmetic of power, that Leto must be removed. And to remove him without staining his own hands, Shaddam had reached toward the oldest enemies of House Atreides, the Harkonnens, whose hatred needed no encouragement, only opportunity. So the trap was not one trap, but two closed upon a single hinge. Arrakis would be given to the Atreides, and the Atreides would be drawn away from the green safety of Caladan to a world of sand and thirst, far from their ancient strongholds, far from the sea. And there, when they were exposed and stretched thin, the Harkonnens would fall upon them in the night, aided in secret by the Emperor's own legions, the Sardaukar, soldiers bred and hardened on a prison world, until cruelty was the only art they knew. Paul had lived the aftermath of that night once already. He had smelled the smoke of the burning palm groves. He had seen his father brought low. He remembered all of it, and the remembering did not fade with the mornings of his childhood, but grew clearer, the way a distant coastline grows clearer as a ship draws near. Yet knowing the trap and springing free of it were two very different labors, and this was the truth that pressed most heavily upon the boy in the long Caladan evenings. He could not simply speak. He could not walk into his father's council chamber and lay the future upon the table like a map, for who would believe a child, and what would belief itself cost? To reveal the full depth of his prescience would be to reveal himself as something the Bene Gesserit had bred and hunted across 90 generations. The Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could be many places at once in the eye of the mind. Such a revelation would draw the attention of powers he was not yet strong enough to answer. So he learned instead the slow art of the gentle nudge, the quiet suggestion. The question asked in a small voice that led a grown mind to think it had discovered the answer on its own. He began with patience, because patience was the only tool he possessed in abundance. He watched the couriers arrive at Castle Caladan, bearing the seals of distant houses, and he learned to read the seasons of the great game by the frequency of their coming and going. He listened at the edges of rooms, a boy seemingly absorbed in some toy or some book, while the men and women of his father's household spoke of grain shipments and guild fees and the shifting alliances of the Landsraad. And slowly, carefully, he began to lay small stones in the river of events, each one too small to notice, each one turning the current by the width of a hair. He asked Tufir Hawat, the old mentat whose loyalty to House Atreides ran deeper than his own blood, questions about the Harkonnens, not accusations, for a child cannot accuse, only questions, wide-eyed and innocent, about why the fat baron on Giedi Prime hated the Atreides so, and whether a clever enemy might not use a gift as easily as a blade. Hawat, whose whole life was suspicion refined into a science, felt these questions settle into his mind like seeds into good soil, and though he never guessed their true source, he found himself thinking longer thoughts about the safety of the house and setting watchers he might otherwise have set a season later. To his mother, the Lady Jessica, Paul offered a different kind of stone. She had trained him in the Bene Gesserit ways, in the reading of the smallest muscles of a face, in the voice that could bend a listener to a command. She knew her son was extraordinary, though even she did not yet grasp how far beyond ordinary he had traveled. And so Paul let her see, now and again, a flash of understanding too deep for his years, a moment of stillness in which he seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. He did this deliberately, a little at a time, so that when the day came for greater truths, the ground would already be prepared, and her love would have somewhere to stand. There was a weight in all this that no observer could have measured. To know the future is to carry it, and Paul carried a future thick with grief. He knew that every ordinary supper in the great hall, every evening when his father laughed and his mother's hand rested on his shoulder, was a thing already lost in the life he remembered, a warmth that had once been taken from him utterly. To sit within that warmth again, knowing what waited at the far end of the road, was a joy so sharp it was nearly pain. He learned to hold both feelings at once, the gladness and the sorrow, the way the desert holds both the day's fire and the night's cold within a single stretch of sand. And beneath the sorrow ran a thread of fierce and quiet hope. For this was the whole meaning of his impossible return. He had not been given a second life merely to relive a tragedy he could not touch. He had been given the map before the journey, the whole terrible pattern laid open, and within that pattern he searched, night after night, for the one loose thread that, pulled at the right moment, might unravel the whole design. He did not yet know if such a thread existed. He knew only that he would spend his childhood and his youth searching for it, laying his small stones, whispering his small questions, building in secret a defense against a betrayal that the men who would commit it had not yet even imagined. So the boy of Caladan grew, and the sea sighed against the cliffs below the castle, and the trap waited far away in the mind of an emperor who did not know he was already watched. Paul Atreides slept each night beneath the sound of the water, holding his knowledge close, and each morning he rose a little stronger, a little more certain, of the shape of the thing he meant to change. Up next in Chapter 6, Arrakis Foreknown, we'll follow Paul as he turns his gaze toward the desert world itself and finds that he knows every dune and cavern, every worm and hidden sea edge, before he has ever set foot upon its burning sand. There are places a person can know without ever having stood upon them. A sailor's child may know the shape of a harbor from a father's stories long before the boy first walks the docks. But Paul Atreides knew Arrakis in a way that went far beyond any story. For he had lived there, had bled there, had loved and lost and risen there in a life that lay behind him like a country left at his back. And so, in the quiet of his Caladan bedchamber, with the cool sea air moving the curtains, the boy would close his eyes and walk the desert in his mind, and every step was sure. He knew the planet the rest of the universe called Dune. He knew it as a world without open water, where the price of a single careless breath was measured in moisture, where the poorest beggar and the greatest ruler alike wore the stillsuit, that marvel of Fremen craft which reclaimed the body's own water drop by precious drop, so that a person walking the deep desert became a small, sealed world, self-sufficient against the killing dryness. He knew the weight of such a suit and the discipline of wearing it well. The slow, controlled walk that wasted nothing, the way one learned to breathe through the catch tube and taste one's own recycled water and be grateful for it. He knew the spice. This above all he knew, for the spice melange was the center around which the whole of Arrakis turned, and around which, in truth, the whole of the known universe turned. The spice extended life. The spice expanded awareness. The spice made possible the folding of space itself, for without it, the navigators of the Spacing Guild could not see the safe paths between the stars. And without those paths, there could be no travel between worlds, no empire, no commerce, no civilization at all. Every thread of human power ran back at last to the sands of a single desert planet. And Paul knew this the way he knew his own heartbeat. He knew, too, the taste of the spice on the air of Arrakis, the cinnamon sharpness of it that lay over everything, in the food, in the water, in the very dust, so that to breathe the air of Dune was to be slowly and forever changed by it. And he knew the makers of the spice, the great sandworms the Fremen called Shai-Hulud, Old Father Eternity, the grandfather of the desert. He had seen them in his first life rise from the deep sand like moving mountains, their vast ringed bodies longer than the greatest ships, their round mouths ringed with crystal teeth, drawn by the rhythm of any steady sound upon the surface. He knew the terror of them, and the majesty of them both. He knew that they were not merely beasts, but the keepers of a hidden cycle. For it was the worms, in their long and secret life, that produced the spice, and to threaten the worms was to threaten the spice, and to threaten the spice was to hold a knife against the throat of the entire empire. This was a truth the Fremen understood in their bones, and the great powers of the universe did not yet suspect, and Paul turned it over in his mind like a smooth stone, knowing what a weapon it might one day become. Most of all, he knew the Fremen. The off-worlders who ruled Arrakis from behind their high garrison walls dismissed the desert people as scattered bands of ragged nomads, few in number and of no account. Paul knew this to be one of the great blind errors of his age. The Fremen were many, far more numerous than any census had ever dared to guess, and they lived not upon the open sand where the worms would take them, but within it, in the Syaches, the hidden cavern communities carved into the rock of the deep desert, sealed against the heat and the thieving air. There they gathered their water in great secret pools, hoarding it generation upon generation toward a dream so vast it could hardly be spoken. The dream of a green Arrakis, a world of open water and growing things, a paradise made from the very sand that now tried each day to kill them. Paul knew the name of the man who carried that dream and gave it the shape of a science. Dr. Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist, the judge of the change. A man who stood with one foot in the emperor's service and the other, secretly, among the Fremen, whom he loved. Kynes dreamed of terraforming the desert across the long, slow patience of centuries, of trapping the moisture, of planting the grasses that would hold the dunes, of turning a single blade of green into a meadow, and a meadow into a world reborn. It was a dream measured not in years but in generations, and the Fremen had taken it into their hearts as a kind of faith. Paul remembered Kynes with tenderness and with grief, for he knew the manner of the man's death in the life that had gone before, alone upon the sand, betrayed by the very emperor he had served. He filed that grief away with all the others and resolved, quietly, that he would try to write a different ending. And so, lying still in the dark of Caladan, the boy mapped the desert planet in his memory as a general maps a battlefield the night before the dawn. He knew the great shield wall of rock that guarded the northern city of Arrakis. He knew the palace that House Atreides would one day occupy, the very rooms of it, the hidden passages, the place where a certain treachery would be discovered too late. He knew the wide basins where the spice lay thick and the botanical testing stations Kynes had established in secret across the wastes, small green miracles hidden in the folds of the land. He knew the paths between the sieges, the ways the Fremen moved unseen across a landscape that swallowed the unwary whole. He held all of it, a whole world entire, behind his closed and childish eyes. There was a strange comfort in this knowing, and also a strange loneliness. For no one around him on the green ocean world of Caladan could imagine the desert that lived so vividly in the boy's mind. To them, Arrakis was a name on a distant star map, a hardship posting, a rumor of sand and danger. To Paul, it was already home, in the way that a place of great suffering and great love becomes a home one can never truly leave. He carried the desert inside the sea, the dryness inside the damp, the future inside the present, and he told no one, and he waited. He understood, too, that all this foreknowledge changed the very ground of the coming trial. In his first life he had arrived on Arrakis a stranger, a boy thrown into a world that meant to kill him, learning its dangers one bloody lesson at a time. This time, he would arrive already knowing where the water lay hidden and where the enemy watched, already carrying in his heart the trust of a people he had not yet met. That was a difference beyond measure. That was the loose thread he had been searching for, or the beginning of it, and he meant to weave with it a different pattern than the one that had bound him before. Up next in Chapter 7, the traitor named in advance, we'll come to the hardest knowledge of all, the tragedy of a good man bent to betrayal against his will, and the delicate mercy Paul begins to imagine for a doctor whose treachery he has already forgiven. Of all the things Paul Atreides remembered, there was one memory he approached the way a person approaches a wound that has never fully healed, gently and with a held breath. It was the memory of a good man made into a traitor, and it troubled the boy more than the memory of any open enemy, because it was not a story of wickedness, but a story of love turned into a weapon by those who had no love in them at all. The man's name was Dr. Wellington Yueh. He was a physician of the Suk school, that ancient and honored order whose members were trusted above all other healers in the known universe. The Suk doctors carried within their minds a thing called imperial conditioning, a deep and supposedly unbreakable barrier against the taking of human life. The diamond tattoo upon a Suk doctor's forehead was a promise written into flesh, a sign that this was a person who could not harm a patient, could not betray a trust, could not be turned. For centuries that conditioning had held. The great houses of the Landsraad slept easier for it, believing that at least their doctors could not be bought. Paul knew the terrible truth. The conditioning of Wellington Yueh had been broken, and it had been broken through the one door that even the deepest discipline leaves ajar. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had taken Yueh's beloved wife, the Lady Wanna, who was herself a Bene Gesserit, and had held her captive, and had used her suffering as a lever against the doctor's heart. Yueh had been promised that his betrayal would buy her freedom, or at the least an end to her pain. He had not truly believed the promise, for he was a clever and a mournful man. But a person who loves will grasp even at a promise he does not believe, because the alternative is to abandon all hope, and hope is the last thing love surrenders. And so the unbreakable had been broken, not by cruelty toward the doctor himself, but by cruelty toward the one he loved. In the life that lay behind him, Paul had seen the shape of this treachery only in its aftermath. He had learned, too late, that it was Yueh who had lowered the shields of the Atreides palace on the night of the great ambush. Yueh who had let the enemy in. Yueh who had delivered his own duke into the hands of the Baron. And yet, even in that first life, when the wound was raw and the smoke still hung in the air, Paul had come to understand that Yueh was not a villain, but a victim. A man crushed between two impossible loyalties until something inside him gave way. Yueh had tried, in his own broken fashion, to strike back at the Baron even as he served him, to plant a final desperate sting in the heart of the man who had ruined him. He had not been evil. He had been used, and then discarded, and his one small revenge had cost him everything. Now, in the long patience of his second life, Paul turned this knowledge over and over, searching it for mercy the way a Fremen searches the sand for water. For here was the strangest gift of his prescience. He knew the traitor's name before the traitor himself had betrayed anyone. He knew the exact hinge upon which the man's tragedy would turn. And where another might have thought only of removing the danger, of seeing Yueh cast out or watched or quietly kept from ever entering the household, Paul found that he could not bear so cold a solution. To punish Yueh for a crime he had not yet committed, a crime born wholly of a love that any decent heart would honor, seemed to Paul a betrayal of its own kind. So the boy began to imagine a gentler path, and he understood at once how narrow and how perilous that path would be. The root of Yueh's treachery was the captivity of the Lady Wanna. Remove that captivity, or its power over the doctor's heart, and the whole terrible engine of the betrayal might never turn. If Wanna could be found, or freed, or if the fiction of her survival could be exposed, then the lever the Baron meant to use would have nothing to press against. Yueh, unbroken, would remain what he had always wished to be, a loyal healer of House Atreides, and the shields of the palace would not fall on that fated night, and everything that flowed from that falling might be diverted into some new and kinder channel. But Paul was a child, and a child cannot search the prison worlds of the Harkonnens for a captive woman. He could not act directly upon so vast a matter. What he could do, and what he began to do with the greatest care, was to lay again his small stones in the river. He drew Thufir Hawat's suspicious attention, gently and by indirection, toward the doctors and healers who might one day serve the house, planting in the old Mentat's mind the wholesome habit of examining every person's history and every person's private griefs. He nurtured in his mother a watchfulness for the Bene Gesserit sisters lost or hidden across the empire. For Jessica had her own quiet channels within the order, and might, in time, learn of a sister named Wanna and the sorrow that surrounded her. Paul could not pull the great lever himself. He could only see to it that the right hands drew near it, so that when the moment came, someone might be standing close enough to hold it fast. He knew the odds were long. He knew that the future was not clay to be shaped at will, but a vast and stubborn river, and that a single boy, however gifted, might push against its current for years and see it close again over the gap he had made. It was possible that Yue would be broken no matter what Paul did, that the Baron would find some other lever, that the tragedy would insist upon happening in one form or another. Prescience had taught Paul this bitter humility. Not every thread would pull loose. Some knots the universe seemed determined to keep tied, and yet he could not stop trying for a very simple reason. He had once stood in the ashes of the outcome and known that no one had ever tried to save the doctor at all, because no one had known in time. He knew in time. Knowledge that is not acted upon is a kind of betrayal of its own, and Paul had already lived through too many betrayals to add that one to their number. So he resolved that whatever else his second life might fail to change, he would at the least reach toward Wellington Yue, not with suspicion and a drawn blade, but with the strange compassion of a man forgiving a wound before it was even given. There was a peace in that resolution, a quiet that settled over the boy on the long Caledon nights. He could not promise himself success. He could promise himself only the attempt, and the mercy that lived inside the attempt. And for now, that was enough to let him rest. Up next, in Chapter 8, A Duke Who Might Be Warned, will turn to the most delicate labor of all, the aching question of how much a son may tell his father about a fate already seen, and how a single warning offered too soon or too late might either save a beloved life or shatter everything. Among all the futures Paul Atreides carried, there was one he could scarcely bring himself to examine directly, the way a person cannot look straight into the sun. It was the fate of his father, Duke Leto Atreides, called by his people the Just, a man of such warmth and such integrity that the mere memory of him could bring a stinging wetness to the boy's eyes in the dark. Paul had lived once through his father's death. He had felt the ground of his whole world drop away. And now, given the impossible gift of his father alive again, walking the halls of Castle Caledon, laughing in the great hall, resting a broad hand upon his son's shoulder, Paul found himself facing a question that had no easy answer, and perhaps no answer at all. Could he save him? And if he could, at what cost? And by what means? The simplest path seemed, at first glance, to be the plainest one. A son might go to his father and tell him everything. He might describe the trap upon Arrakis, name the traitor within the household, lay out the hour and the manner of the coming attack. Surely a warning so complete would be enough to turn the Duke aside from his doom. But the longer Paul studied this path, the more clearly he saw its dangers, and the more he understood why it was closed to him. For one thing, there was the matter of belief. Leto was a wise and open-minded man, but no father, however loving, easily accepts that his young son holds the whole future in his mind, laid out like a map of a country already crossed. To speak of such things openly was to invite doubt at best and fear at worst. Worse still, a warning too complete might set in motion the very ruin it sought to prevent. Paul knew the strange treachery of prophecy, how a foretold disaster, once spoken aloud, could twist the actions of those who heard it until they walked straight into the arms of the thing they fled. If Leto, warned in full, refused the Emperor's gift of Arrakis outright, that refusal itself would be read across the Landsrod as fear, as weakness, as a challenge, and the Emperor, who wished the Duke destroyed, would simply find another road to the same end. The trap was not a single door that could be locked. It was a whole house of doors, and the Emperor held the keys to all of them. And there was a deeper danger yet, one that touched the very foundation of who Leto was. The Duke's greatness lay in his honor. He would not save himself by any means that stained that honor, would not flee, would not abandon the people who had begun to depend upon him, would not purchase his own survival with the safety of his house and his name. To press him too hard towards self-preservation would be to ask him to become someone other than himself, and Paul understood, with a grief that was almost unbearable, that a father saved at the price of his soul would not truly be saved at all. He would be a stranger wearing a beloved face. So Paul set aside the dream of the single perfect warning and took up instead the same patient craft he had been practicing since the first day of his return, the craft of the small stone laid quietly in the river. He would not try to change his father's heart. He would try, instead, to change the ground beneath his father's feet, so that when the Duke made his own honorable choices, those choices would carry him towards safety rather than toward ruin. He began, as always, through Thufir Hawat and through his mother, the two minds nearest to the Duke and most trusted by him. Through his careful questions to the old Mentat, Paul nurtured a deeper wariness of the gift of Arrakis, a habit of treating every imperial favor as a possible blade. Hawat, whose loyalty was total and whose suspicion was legendary, needed only the smallest nudge to begin preparing contingencies against betrayal, escape routes, hidden caches, lines of retreat, that in the first life had been laid too thinly and too late. Paul could not tell Hawat what he knew. He could only help the man to distrust more thoroughly the very things that ought to be distrusted, and to prepare, without knowing why, for the worst that Paul remembered. To his father directly, Paul offered something subtler still. He let the Duke see in his son an unusual gravity, a wisdom beyond a boy's years, and he used that gravity to speak, now and again, of the Fremen. In the life that had gone before, House Atreides had come to value the desert people far too late, seeing them at first as a curiosity, a source of possible troops, and only at the very end grasping that in the Fremen lay the true and hidden power of Arrakis. Paul labored to plant that understanding earlier. He spoke to his father, in a child's simple way, of the desert folk who lived where no one else could live, of how a wise duke might win their friendship, and how such friendship might be worth more than any garrison of soldiers. Leto, who had a gift for seeing the worth in overlooked people, took these small seeds and let them grow in his own mind, so that when at last the house turned toward Arrakis, the Duke would arrive already inclined to seek the desert people as allies, rather than to command them as subjects. In this way, Paul hoped to build a stronger house than the one that had fallen, a house with deeper roots among the Fremen, with better watchmen set against betrayal, with escape held ready should the worst arrive. He could not promise his father's survival. He had learned that the great river of time did not surrender its dead so easily, and there were nights when he lay awake and feared that whatever he did, however cleverly he laid his stones, the current would simply close again and carry his father to the same lonely end. That fear was the heaviest thing the boy carried, heavier than the knowledge of the jihad, heavier than any burden of prescience, for it was made not of the fate of empires, but of the love of a son for his father. And yet even here, Paul found a fragile peace, and it was this. He no longer stood helpless in the ashes, knowing only after the fact what might have been done. This time, he knew before. This time, he could act, however indirectly, however uncertainly, and the mere fact of acting changed the weight of the thing he bore. If the river insisted upon its course, then at the least his father would go to his fate surrounded by a house better prepared and better loved than before. and among people who might carry the Atreides name forward with less blood and less sorrow than the first time. And if some door, somewhere, might yet be held open by a single stone laid in the right place, then Paul meant to be the one who laid it, patiently and in secret, through all the long green years of his second boyhood. So he watched his father cross the great hall in the evening light, and he memorized the sight of him, and he loved him with a fierceness that had grief folded inside it. And he went on quietly building, day by day, the frail defenses of hope. Up next in Chapter 9, the desert power gathered early will follow Paul as he reaches out toward Stilgar and the Fremen sooner than any Atreides ever dared, seeking to build through foreknowledge and trust the alliance that once had to be paid for in disaster and blood. Chapter 9. The desert power gathered early. There is a particular hush that settles over Arrakis in the last hour before the sun lifts free of the horizon. A stillness so complete that even the sand seems to hold its breath. In that hour, the boy, who was also an old soul, stood at the lip of a rock shelf far from any city, and he watched the desert the way a returning traveler watches a house he once lived in and never forgot. He had walked this floor of the world before, in another turning of his life, and he had learned its every mercy and every cruelty at a terrible price. This time, he came to it early and softly, and with all his knowledge folded quietly inside him like a seed held in a closed hand. In the life he remembered, the Fremen had come to House Atreides only after ruin, only after his father was dead and his people scattered, and the great betrayal had already broken across them like a wave. Trust in that other life had been paid for with grief, and every friendship among the Sietch folk had been founded on a shared sorrow. Now, walking the dunes with the memory of all that loss carried gently behind his eyes, Paul understood that he had been given the rarest of gifts. He had been given time. He could reach the desert people before the disaster rather than after it, and he could offer them not the desperation of a fugitive, but the honest hand of one who already loved them. He knew their names. That was the strange and tender weight of it. He knew Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Tabr, the broad and weathered leader whose loyalty, once given, was deeper than any well. He knew the cadence of Stilgar's speech and the fierce practical wisdom beneath it, the way the man measured a stranger by the water in his flesh and the honesty in his stance. He knew the customs of challenge and courtesy, the sacred arithmetic of moisture, the way a body's water belonged to the tribe. He knew that among the Fremen a promise was a thing more solid than stone, and that a lie discovered would close every door forever. So he came to them carefully, as a person comes to a thing precious and easily broken. The first meetings were slight and unhurried. In this reshaped life, with his father Leto still living and the house of Atreides holding Arrakis under a fragile new stewardship, young Paul had found ways to be present where the desert touched the edges of the settled lands. He listened more than he spoke, which for a child was disarming, and for a Kwisatz Haderach was strategy of the gentlest kind. He let the Fremen see that the Atreides did not despise them. He let small kindnesses accumulate, the return of a lost water ring, a warning about a patrol quietly passed along, a respect for the deep places that no off-worlder was supposed to understand. Each kindness was a stone laid without noise, and slowly a bridge began to form across a gulf that in his other life had never closed until blood filled it. Stilgar was cautious, as a good Naib must be. He had seen off-worlders come and go, seen them take the spice and give nothing, seen them treat the desert as a mine and the desert people as vermin to be swept from it. He did not trust easily, and Paul did not ask him to. Instead, the boy offered patience, which is the one currency the desert respects above all others, for the desert itself is nothing but patience made vast. Season by season, the Naib watched this strange young Atreides, and season by season he found nothing false in him, only a depth that was difficult to name and a courtesy that never wavered. What Stilgar could not know, and what Paul would not tell him, was that the boy already grieved for a version of the Naib who had followed him into a holy war and lost himself in it. This time, Paul meant to gather the desert power without lighting that fire. He thought often of the difference between the two roads. In his first life, the alliance with the Fremen had been forged in vengeance, and vengeance, he had learned, is a fuel that burns everything it touches, including the hand that lights it. The Fremen had made him their Mahdi, their prophet, and he had ridden their fury across the stars until it became a thing no single will could stop, not even his own. He remembered the numbers of the dead, 60 and 100 billion souls across the worlds, a figure so large it stopped being grief and became only weight. He would not do it that way again. If the desert power was to be gathered, it would be gathered as friendship and not as a weapon aimed at heaven. And so he moved slowly. He learned again the things the Fremen knew, not to impress them, but to honor them. He relearned the discipline of water, how a stillsuit reclaims the body's moisture, how a walk across open sand must fall into an arrhythmic step so that no sandworm reads it as a signal. He relearned the reading of the wind and the meaning of a distant blur on the dunes. He did these things as though for the first time, and the doing of them a second time gave them a quality of ceremony, of an old prayer said again with fuller understanding. The Fremen noticed. They noticed that this child of a great house did not flinch from their world, that he treated the desert as a living thing to be respected, rather than a hostile emptiness to be conquered. There was a woman among them, or there would be, whose face already lived in his memory as the face of everything he had loved and lost. He did not seek her yet. He let the future keep its own pace in that one thing. For some approaches must not be forced, and the tenderest futures are the most easily shattered by an eager hand. It was enough, for now, to feel the shape of the alliance forming around him, like the slow accretion of a dune, grain settling upon grain until a mountain of sand stands where before there was only flat ground. He understood the ecology too, better perhaps than the planetologist Kynes, who dreamed of turning Arrakis green. He knew the sacred bargain between the sandworms and the spice, the way melange was born of a cycle that ran deeper than any single lifetime, the way the Fremen tended a hidden dream of open water and growing things. He knew that this dream was a lever that could move the whole desert, and he held that knowledge with care, for a lever in the wrong hands breaks what it means to lift. By the time the season turned again, something had changed that no ledger in any city could measure. The desert people, who trusted almost no one from the worlds beyond, had begun to trust one strange boy of House Atreides. Not fully, not yet, for full trust among the Fremen was a mountain climbed over years. But the first path up that mountain had been found, and it had been found without a single betrayal, without a single death, without the terrible engine of prophecy roaring to life. Paul stood again on his rock shelf as the sun at last broke free and poured its long light across the dunes, and he let himself feel, quietly, the beginning of a hope that in his other life he had never been permitted. The desert power was gathering, and this time it was gathering gently. Up next in Chapter 10, Sietch Tabr and the Water of Life, we'll follow Paul into the hidden heart of the Fremen world, into the caverns of Sietch Tabr, toward the sacred trial and the transformed poison, and toward a face he had loved across the fold of 2 lifetimes. Chapter 10, Sietch Tabr and the Water of Life. Deep beneath the broken rock of the Shield Wall country, where the desert hides its truest treasures from the eyes of the worlds above, There is a place that the Fremen call Sietch Tabr. It is not a city and not a fortress, though it is stronger than either. It is a warren of caverns carved and worn into the living stone, a cool refuge from the murdering sun, a place of water kept secret and life kept close. In the life Paul remembered, he had come to Sietch Tabr as a hunted boy stripped of everything, arriving in grief with his mother at his side and the ashes of his house behind him. Now he came to it differently, and the difference was so profound that it moved through him like a slow warmth as he passed through the moisture seals and into the dim, breathing hush of the deep rock. The Sietch was alive in the way that a hive is alive, in the way that a heart is alive, a place of quiet, constant motion where nothing was wasted and everything belonged. He knew its sounds before he heard them, the murmur of many people living close, the soft mechanical sighing of the wind traps that pulled moisture from the night air, the distant rhythm of the dew collectors and the spinning of spice fiber into rope. He knew the smell of it, the sharp cinnamon note of melange that soaked into everything the Fremen touched, so that their very breath carried the perfume of the spice. He walked its passages as a man walks the rooms of a childhood home, seeing at once the place before him and the memory laid over it like a second image, and the layering of the two nearly undid him with tenderness. The Fremen watched him. Trust had been building across the seasons, stone laid upon patient stone, and it had brought him at last to the threshold of their most guarded places. To be brought into a Sietch was no small thing. It meant that the desert people had begun to count him, in some careful measure, as one who might belong. Stilgar walked beside him through the caverns, and though the Naib said little, his presence was itself a statement, a declaration to the tribe that this stranger was under his regard. Paul honored the weight of that with silence, and with a bearing that asked for nothing. At the center of the Sietch's spiritual life, there was a mystery that ran deeper than any cavern, and its name was the water of life. Paul knew it well, too well, for it had nearly killed him once and had remade him entirely. The water of life was the bile of a drowned sandworm, a poison so potent that a single unaltered drop could stop a heart, and yet in the alchemy of the Sietch, it was the most sacred substance the Fremen possessed. It could be changed. A reverend mother, and only a reverend mother, could take that killing poison into her body and transform it within herself, converting death into revelation, so that the whole Sietch might share in the changed water and enter together into a communion beyond ordinary sense. It was the hinge upon which Fremen mysticism turned, and in his first life, it had been the hinge upon which his own transformation had turned as well. He remembered the trial. He remembered drinking the changed water and falling into a stillness that others took for death. Remembered walking through weeks of inner darkness while his mind reordered the very structure of time within him. Remembered waking with the full prescience opened at last, the Kwisatz Haderach, fully born. It had been a passage through fire, and he had come out the other side, altered past returning. Now, standing again near the sacred chamber where the water was kept, he understood that this time the passage might be different, for he already carried the awakened mind. He was not a boy who needed to be broken open into prophecy. He was a prophet who had already been broken and had somehow been given his youth again. The water of life could not make him what he already was, but it could still deepen him, and it could still bind him to the Fremen in the one way they held most holy. There was a reverend mother in the Sietch, old and ferocious and wise, her body a vessel of the transformed water, and her mind a library of every mother who had come before her, the ancestral memory passed woman to woman down the long chain of the sisterhood. In his other life, this had been Reverend Mother Ramallo, who had passed her burden to his own mother Jessica in a moment of crisis and near catastrophe. Paul approached the whole matter now with a care so fine it was almost reverence, for he knew how easily the sacred could tip into disaster. He would not force the trial. He would let the Fremen offer it in their own time and their own way, as a gift rather than a demand, so that whatever passage came would be woven into their trust and not torn out of their fear. And there was Chani. He had held her name at a distance for so long, letting the future keep its pace, refusing to reach for the tenderest thing before its season. But the Sietch was her home, and in the dim, warm passages he found her at last, and the finding of her was like the finding of water after a long, dry crossing. She did not know him, not truly, not yet. To her he was a strange young man of an off-world house who had somehow earned the guarded regard of her people. But he knew her, knew the blue in blue of her eyes stained by a life among the spice, knew the fierce quiet of her, and the way she carried herself like a blade sheathed in kindness. He had loved her across the whole width of a life and a death, and to stand before her again, alive and unhurt and unmarked by any of the sorrows he remembered, was almost more than the returning soul could hold. He let none of it show. He let the future keep its slow and gentle pace. But something in him settled that had not been settled in a very long time, as though a part of his soul had at last come home to the desert. The deep Sietch became, over the turning of the days, a second home to him in truth and not only in memory. He relearned its ways, the discipline and the ritual, the fierce communal love that bound the Fremen into a single body against the killing world above. He learned again the songs sung low in the caverns, the prayers for water, the honoring of the dead whose moisture returned to the tribe. He did these things with a fullness that came from having lost them once, and the Fremen, watching, felt the depth of him without being able to name it. They began to speak of him among themselves, cautiously, as one who understood the desert as a Fremen understands it, which was the highest thing they knew how to say of any soul. He knew that trials lay ahead, and choices sharper than any blade. He knew that the water of life still waited, and the great worms still waited, and the terrible visions of a holy war still waited beyond them all. But for now, he let himself rest in the hush of the deep rock, near the woman he had loved across 2 lifetimes, among a people who were slowly, patiently, beginning to call him their own. The sacred poison waited in its chamber, and the future waited in the folds of his prescient mind, and Paul, for one quiet stretch of days, simply allowed himself to belong. Up next in Chapter 11, The Worm and the Rider, we'll walk out onto the open sand with Paul as he learns once more to call the great Shai-Hulud, and to ride the Maker across the dunes without the terror that shadowed him the first time. Chapter 11, The Worm and the Rider. Of all the wonders and terrors of Arrakis, none is greater than the sandworm, the Maker, the beast the Fremen name with awe and call Shai-Hulud. It is a creature so vast that the mind refuses at first to accept it, a living leviathan of the deep desert that moves beneath the dunes like a ship beneath the waves, and rises through the sand in a great arching wall of segmented flesh and crystalline teeth, taller than towers, older than empires. To the off-worlder, it is a monster and a death. To the Fremen, it is a god and a road. And to Paul Atreides, who had ridden the Makers across a burning history in the life he remembered, it was both a memory and a mountain still to be climbed again. He came out onto the open sand to relearn the calling of the worm in the cool blue hour when the desert forgives, and Stilgar and a small band of the Fremen came with him. For the calling of the Maker is not a thing done alone. In his first life, this had been the great test of his acceptance among the desert people, the proof that he was truly one of them. The moment the off-world boy became a rider of the sand, and so became, in Fremen eyes, a man. He had passed that test once in fear and desperation, a hunted youth forcing himself to a thing that terrified him because the alternative was death. Now he came to it in the fullness of foreknowledge, and though a worm is a thing that no amount of foreknowledge can render tame, the terror had gone out of it. In its place was something quieter, a deep respect, and beneath the respect, a strange and steadying calm. The calling begins with a summons that the whole desert can feel. The Fremen use a device called a thumper, a small mechanism driven into the sand that beats a slow, steady rhythm against the floor of the world. A heartbeat of stone that carries down and down until the maker, far below, turns toward it. For the worm is drawn to rhythm the way a moth is drawn to flame, roused by any steady beat that breaks the arrhythmic silence of the sand. Paul set the thumper and stepped back, and the whole band waited in the growing light, and the desert held its breath. Then the beating began, patient and relentless, and somewhere far beneath them, the great beast heard it and began to rise. He felt it before he saw it. There is a warning in the sand when a maker comes, a subtle change in the texture of the ground, a low trembling that climbs from the soles of the feet into the chest. The Fremen read these signs the way a sailor reads the sea, and Paul read them too, the whole knowledge of it waking in his body as though it had never slept. A ridge of disturbed sand appeared far out on the dune sea, a moving wake with no boat before it, and it swelled and neared with a speed that seemed impossible for so great a thing. Then the sand broke open, and the maker rose, and even for a man who had ridden 1,000 such beasts across the fire of a holy war, the sight of it stopped the breath in his throat. It was immense beyond immensity, a cliff of living flesh, streaming sand from its ringed body. Its mouth a cavern lined with the crystal teeth that ground the deep rock and made, in some slow alchemy of ages, the spice itself. To ride the maker of Fremen must catch it. This is the hard heart of the whole discipline, and it cannot be done from a distance or in comfort. The rider must run alongside the rising worm with the great hooks the Fremen call maker hooks, and must set those hooks into the leading edge of one of the worm's ring segments, prying the segment open just enough that a fold of the tender inner flesh is exposed to the abrasive sand. The worm, to protect that soft inner tissue from the scouring grit, will not roll or dive while the segment is held open. Instead, it rises, turning its opened flank away from the sand, lifting the held ring toward the sky, and so the rider mounts to the crest of the beast and turns it by the placement of his hooks. It is a thing of astonishing daring, and it must be done in the space of a few breaths, and a single failure means a fall beneath the rolling body or into the grinding mouth. Paul ran. The whole memory of it moved through his limbs, the timing and the balance and the exact reading of the beast's motion, and this time there was no fear to fight against, only the clean focus of a discipline relived. He matched his pace to the surging rise of the maker, and at the precise instant he set his hooks and pulled, and the vast segment lifted under his hands, and the worm, feeling the sand kept from its inner flesh, turned its opened flank upward and rose beneath him like a wave lifting a swimmer. And then he was upon it, standing on the crest of a living mountain, the wind of its passage roaring past him, the whole desert opening below him in a sweep of gold and shadow, the maker carrying him across the dunes as it had carried him across a history he was trying now to unwrite. The Fremen who watched him made no sound, for the sand does not reward noise. But he could feel the change in them. In the calling and catching of a maker, they read the truest measure of a soul. And what they read in Paul that morning went beyond the ordinary passing of the test. He rode as one born to it, without the flailing terror of the novice, and without the reckless swagger of the fool, with a mastery so quiet It seemed less a triumph over the worm than a courtesy exchanged with it. Stilgar, riding near him on the same great beast, watched the young Atreides with an expression that the Neeb himself might not have been able to name. A mingling of pride and wonder, and a growing certainty about this strange soul that had come into their midst. And Paul, riding the Maker across the open sand, let himself feel the difference between the two lives. In the first, this ride had been a step toward war. Every skill he had mastered among the Fremen had been another stone in the road to the jihad, another gathering of the power that would eventually pour across the stars in his name. He had ridden the worm as a prophet, ascending toward a terrible destiny. Now he rode it as a man rejoining a beloved world. And the great beast beneath him was not a weapon, and not a symbol of conquest, but simply itself, an ancient wonder of the desert, a god of sand who owed nothing to any empire. He let the worm carry him where the Fremen guided it, and he watched the dunes flow past, and he felt for a long unhurried, while a kind of peace he had thought forever lost to him, the peace of a thing done well for its own sake, and not for the sake of a war. When at last the Maker tired, and they let it go, sliding down from its crest as it burrowed back into the deep, Paul stood on the sand and watched the great wake of it fade into the dunes, and he understood that he had passed once more into the fullest circle of the Fremen. He was a rider of the sand. He was, in the desert's own reckoning, a man of the desert. And he had become so this time, without the shadow of the holy war falling across the achievement, without a single life spent to purchase it. The mastery was clean. The worm had answered, and the rider had risen, and no army had marched because of it. Up next in Chapter 12, the jihad he sees coming, will turn with Paul toward the darkest thing his prescience carries, the terrible vision of a holy war blazing across the stars in his name, and the burden of trying, with all his knowledge, to steer humanity around that fire. Chapter 12. The jihad he sees coming. There is a shadow that lies across the whole of Paul Atreides' second life, and it does not come from the sun or from any enemy of flesh. It comes from the future. For all the softness of his reborn childhood, for all the tenderness of relearned love, and the clean joy of the worm ridden without fear, there remains in the depths of his prescient mind a vision so terrible that he must turn away from it 100 times a day and can never truly escape it. It is the vision of the jihad, the holy war, the great and unstoppable fire that in the life he remembered had poured out of Arrakis and across the settled worlds, carrying his name like a torch and leaving billions of the dead in its wake. He had lived it once. He had helped to light it and had been unable to put it out. And now, given a second turning of his life, he carried the memory of that fire the way a man carries the scar of a wound that reaches to the bone. He remembered how it had begun, which was the most frightening thing of all, because it had not begun with a decision. No single choice had summoned the jihad. It had grown out of 1,000 small necessities, out of vengeance and survival and the terrible magnetism of prophecy, out of a people's ancient longing for a Messiah meeting the raw fact of his prescient power. The Fremen had needed a Mahdi, and grief had made him one, and once the legend caught it burned beyond any hand's control, even his own. He had stood at the center of it, a young man who wanted only to save his family and free a people, and he had watched his name become a banner under which fanatics marched to conquer the stars. The visions had shown it to him before it came, the green and black banners, the warriors pouring across world after world, the numbers of the dead climbing past all comprehension, and he had not been able to find the path that avoided it. Every road he searched in the branching country of the future seemed to bend, sooner or later, toward that same fire. This was the deepest reason he had chosen, in his reborn life, the slow and gentle way. Everything he had done differently The early friendship with the Fremen, offered as trust rather than forged in disaster. The mastery gained without terror. The alliance built without vengeance. All of it was aimed at this single, unspeakable thing. He was trying to reach the destiny that his prescience showed him, while starving the fire of the fuel that had once fed it. For he had come to understand, across 2 lifetimes of looking, that the jihad had fed on grief and on the desperation of a hunted people who had nothing left but their profit. If the grief could be lessened, if the desperation could be turned aside, if the Fremen could come to him as friends rather than as the last defenders of a broken and vengeful cause, then perhaps the fire would find nothing to catch upon. Perhaps, but prescience is a cruel and treacherous gift, and Paul knew its treacheries better than any soul who had ever lived. He knew that the future is not a fixed painting to be studied, but a vast and shifting country of branching paths, and that the very act of seeing a path changes it, and that a man who steers by prescient vision can steer himself directly into the thing he most wishes to avoid. He remembered how, in his first life, his own foreknowledge had become a kind of trap. How the more clearly he saw the jihad, the more surely his choices seemed to serve it, until he began to wonder whether prophecy did not so much predict the future as help to build it. There was a horror in that thought that never entirely left him. The seer becomes a part of the thing he sees. The map draws the territory. He walked now with the constant care of a man crossing a floor he knows to be mined, aware that a single confident step in the wrong direction could set off the very blast he was tiptoeing to avoid. And there was another cruelty folded inside the first, subtler and colder. For as Paul searched the branching country of time for a road that led around the jihad, he began to glimpse, far down certain paths, hints of a thing more terrible still. He saw that the fire, if smothered here, might smolder elsewhere. He saw that humanity carried within it a deep and dangerous stagnation, a tendency to grow safe and enclosed and brittle, and that some awful pressure might be needed to break it open and drive it outward and keep it alive across the long reaches of time. In his first life, this glimpse had grown into the vision of the Golden Path, a road so harsh and so long that the mind recoiled from it, a road that seemed to demand the very tyranny and upheaval he most wished to spare the human worlds. He did not follow that thread yet. He turned from it, as a man turns from a door behind which something waits that he is not ready to face. But he knew it was there, and knowing it darkened even his gentlest hopes, for it whispered that the jihad he was trying to prevent might be, in some monstrous calculus of survival, the lesser of the fires the future held. He carried all of this alone, which was perhaps the heaviest part of the burden. There was no one he could tell. His mother Jessica, alive and well in this reshaped life, knew nothing of the war that had never happened. His father Leto, whom he had labored so carefully to save, could not be asked to bear the weight of a doom that existed only in his son's remembering mind. The Fremen who were beginning to love him did not know that in another turning of time they had become the burning spearhead of a holy war fought in his name. Chani, whose face was the one bright and human center of all his terrible knowledge, could not be told how many times he had already lost her across the branching paths of prophecy. So he held the vision of the jihad the way one holds a coal too hot to drop and too dangerous to set down, in silence, alone, hour after hour and day after day, steering the whole of his second life by the light of a fire he prayed would never be lit. Yet he did not despair, and this too was a discipline learned across 2 lifetimes. He had seen the fire, but he had also seen, faint and flickering at the edges of the branching country, the possibility of a road that led past it. a way through the sand gentle enough to reach the future without burning the present to reach it. It was narrow, and it was uncertain, and every day it seemed to shift beneath his searching sight. But it was there. He held to it the way a traveler in a storm holds to a single distant point of light, and he bent all his patience and all his foreknowledge toward it. He would not summon the jihad. If it lay within any power of his to prevent, no army would ever march across the stars carrying his name like a torch. He had lit that fire once. He would spend this whole second life, if he had to, making certain he never lit it again. Up next, in Chapter 13, Spice, Prescience, and a Wider Eye, will descend deeper with Paul into the visions themselves, into the branching paths of time and the distant, awful glimpse of the golden path that waits at the end of every road. Spice moved through the boy like weather, and the boy had learned, over the slow years of his second life, to move with it rather than against it. On Arrakis, the melange was everywhere, in the food and the air and the fine dust that settled on every surface. And where once it had opened his mind like a sudden door flung wide, now it welcomed him like an old and patient friend. Paul Atreides sat in the quiet of a stone chamber deep within the rock, far from the wind and the killing sun, and let the spice do its slow work upon his awareness. He did not fight it. He had learned, in a life already lived, that the visions came most gently to the one who did not clutch at them, and so he breathed and softened, and allowed the wider eye within him to open by degrees. At first there was only the familiar unfolding, the sense of time thinning around him like mist burning off the morning sea he still remembered from Caladan. Then, slowly, the many paths of the future spread before him, and this was the part that never lost its strangeness, no matter how many times he walked into it. Time was not a single road. It was a great delta of possibility, a fan of countless branching channels, each one a way that things might go, each one shimmering faintly with its own weight of likelihood. He had seen this delta in his first life, and he saw it again now, but he saw it differently, for he carried the memory of having walked one of its channels all the way to its bitter mouth, and that memory changed the way the branches looked to him. He had, in that first life, followed the great flood down its widest and most terrible channel, the one that led through the Holy War, the one that ended in an ocean of blood carried across the stars in his name. Now, sitting in the cool dark, he could see that channel again, broad and glittering and awful, and he could see the smaller ways that broke off from it, the quieter waters that most of his younger self had never noticed, because the great current had pulled so hard. This was the gift of the second life, that he could stand at the branching and see the smaller paths before the flood swept him past them, and it was also the burden, for to see a gentler way was to become responsible for the choosing of it. The spice deepened, and his awareness widened further, and now he looked past the near years, past Arrakis and the Emperor and the great houses, out toward the far distances of time where the visions grew vast and cold and difficult to hold. Here the branches began to converge again, drawing together the way the many channels of a delta finally join the sea, and here he began to glimpse the thing that had haunted the deepest part of his first prescience, the thing he had come to call the Golden Path. It was not a road he wished to see. It stretched away across thousands of years, across the long, slow strangling of humankind by its own comforts and its own dependence, and it showed him that the survival of the whole species might one day demand a price so heavy that no single heart could carry it without breaking. He held the vision only for a moment, and then he let it recede, for it was too great a weight to bear all at once, and he had learned that a mind could be crushed by trying to swallow the ocean in a single breath. What he took from that distant glimpse was not despair, but a kind of sober tenderness. He understood, more clearly than he ever had in his younger fury, that every road through time carried its own sorrows, and that there was no path so gentle that it cost nothing at all. The wider eye showed him this without cruelty. It simply laid the branches before him, the war and the peace, the mercy and the ruin, the many faces of what might be, and it let him understand that his task was not to find a road without pain, but to find the road with the least of it, and to walk that road with his eyes open. He thought, as the spice slowly loosened its hold, about how different this seeing was from the seeing of his first life. Then, prescience had come upon him like a storm, sudden and overwhelming, a terror as much as a gift, and he had been a young man swept along by it, reacting, grasping, trying to keep his footing in a flood that would not slow. Now, he came to the visions as one who had already survived them once, and this changed everything. He was no longer their prisoner. He could enter the trance and leave it, could look upon the branching delta and then set it gently aside, could hold the knowledge of the far golden path without being broken upon it, because he had made his peace with the truth that he could not save everyone from everything, and that this did not excuse him from saving whom he could. There was a discipline in this, and it was a discipline he had built slowly across the years of his return. The Bene Gesserit teaching his mother had given him, the stillness of the Prana Bindu, the ordering clarity of the Mentat way that Thufir Hawat had drilled into him twice over. All of these came together now into a single, quiet strength, a way of holding the vast and terrible without flinching and without freezing. He breathed, and he let the chamber come back around him, the rough stone, the faint far sound of the Sayach going about its life, the dry, clean smell of the deep desert. The delta of time folded softly closed within him, and he was simply a young man again, sitting alone in the dark, carrying more than any young man should have to carry, and carrying it gently. He knew, from the wider eye, the shape of the near days that were coming. He knew the schemes that were tightening around this world like a snare, the old fat spider of a baron spinning his threads, the distant emperor moving his hidden soldiers into place, the whole vast machinery of betrayal and greed that had, in his first life, come down upon his family like a falling mountain. He knew all of it, and now, having widened his eye and steadied his heart, he was ready to begin turning that knowledge into action. Not with vengeance, for vengeance had been the seed of the very jihad he wished to spare the stars. With patience, instead, with the slow, careful unwinding of a plot that its makers believed was still their secret. He considered, too, how strange it was that the spice, which the Guild and the Bene Gesserit and the Emperor all coveted as the most precious substance in the universe, was for him a doorway he could open and close at will. To the navigators of the Guild it was the fuel of their folded travel between the stars. To the sisters of his mother's order, it was a key that unlocked the memories of their mothers reaching back through the generations. To the Emperor, it was simply wealth and power beyond counting. To Paul it was all of these, and something more, a thing that had reshaped his mind twice over, and he handled it now with the quiet care of a man who has learned exactly how much a single substance can give and how much it can take away. He would not let it master him. He would let it serve, and no more. For a long while, he simply rested there in the aftermath of the spice, letting his breathing slow, letting the visions settle like dust after wind. The great branching river of time still ran within him, but softly now, a murmur rather than a flood. He had looked into the wider eye and had not been consumed. He had seen the golden path in the far distance and had turned, for now, toward nearer and gentler work. And somewhere in the dark rock around him, the desert kept its ancient silence, and the worms moved far below, and the future waited, patient and unwritten, for the choices he had come back to make. Up next in Chapter 14, The Harkonnen Undone, we'll follow Paul as he begins, thread by patient thread, to unravel the schemes of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, choosing the slow work of dismantling a plot over the swift heat of revenge. In his first life, Paul Atreides had learned to hate the name of Harkonnen with a completeness that had nearly hollowed him out. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had murdered his father, had scattered and hunted his family, had turned the whole weight of a great house toward the ruin of everything Paul loved, and the young man he had once been had answered that ruin with a fury that swept across the stars. Now, in the quiet of his second life, Paul looked upon the Baron differently. He did not love him. He never would. But he had come to understand that hatred was a fuel that burned hot and burned everything, and that the fire he had lit with it in his first life had consumed far more than the guilty. So this time he chose a colder and a kinder instrument. This time he chose patience. The Baron was, Paul knew, a creature of appetites and schemes, a vast and cunning man who moved through the world by way of debts and secrets and carefully hidden knives. His plots were not simple. They were layered, one folded inside another, feints wrapped around feints, so that even those who served him rarely saw the whole shape of what he intended. In his first life, Paul had understood this shape only after it had fallen upon him, only in the wreckage, when understanding could do nothing but sharpen grief into vengeance. Now he understood it in advance, every thread of it, and understanding it in advance meant that he could reach into the great tangle and begin, very quietly, to pull. He began with the smallest threads, the ones no one would miss. A rumor here, redirected before it could reach the ear it was meant for. A shipment there, delayed by an ordinary accident that Paul had known to arrange, because he had known, from the wider eye, exactly when and where the Baron's agents expected it. He did not strike at the Baron directly. To strike directly would be to reveal that he saw, and the one advantage Paul held above all others was that the Baron did not know he was seen. So Paul worked in the margins, in the places where a scheme was most fragile, where a single loosened thread could make a whole knot slip without anyone quite understanding why. The Baron's plot against House Atreides depended, Paul knew, upon a great many things happening in a precise order. It depended upon the Atreides being lured to Arrakis and stripped of their old defenses. It depended upon a traitor within the household, upon the hidden soldiers of the Emperor arriving unseen, upon the Fremen being dismissed as a scattered and harmless rabble of the deep desert. Each of these was a load-bearing beam in the Baron's great trap, and Paul, moving softly across the years, set himself to weakening them one at a time, so gently that the weakening would look like nothing more than the ordinary friction of the world. He turned his attention first to the matter of information, for the Baron's power rested upon knowing what others did not. Paul, with his mother Jessica's Bene Gesserit teaching and Thufir Hawat's Mentat discipline, both alive within him, had become extraordinarily skilled at the quiet management of what was known and by whom. Where the Baron's spies expected to find weakness, Paul arranged that they find strength instead, so that the fat man in his distant stronghold began, without ever suspecting the cause, to misjudge the readiness of House Atreides. A commander who believes his enemy weaker than he is will commit himself carelessly, and a commander who believes his enemy stronger will hesitate. Paul fed the Baron's certainty in small false portions, and each portion led the great scheme a little further from the ground it had been built upon. There was a particular pleasure, though Paul held it at a careful distance, in undoing the Baron's cruelties before they could be committed. In his first life, he had watched good people die because the Baron willed it. Now he could see those deaths coming from far off, could see the moment and the method and the hand, and could reach out quietly to move the intended victim out of the path of the falling blade. A servant reassigned. A messenger sent by a different road. A meeting that never quite happened because one of its participants was, by the gentlest of arrangements, elsewhere. None of it looked like intervention. All of it looked like luck. And thread by thread the Baron's design, which had once fallen upon the Atreides like a mountain, began instead to sag and to slip and to come undone. Paul was careful, always, to remember what he was doing and why. He was not playing a game. He was not savoring a revenge dressed up as strategy. He held himself firmly to the understanding that the goal was not the Baron's suffering, but the sparing of all those the Baron's scheme would otherwise destroy, and above that, the turning of history away from the great fire of the jihad. Vengeance, he knew, was a channel that led back toward that fire. If he tore the Baron down in wrath, if he made of the man a symbol of everything to be avenged, he would light in the hearts of others the very passion he had come back to extinguish. So he kept his own heart cool. He undid the plot the way a patient hand undoes a knot, without anger, without haste, feeling for the loops that would give. It was slow work, and it asked much of him. There were nights when the old hatred rose in him, when the memory of his father's death pressed close and whispered that the Baron deserved a swifter and a crueler ending. On those nights, Paul went out alone under the enormous desert sky, and he stood beneath the cold and countless stars, and he let the whisper move through him and pass, the way his mother had taught him to let fear move through and pass, until only the stillness remained. He would not become the instrument of his own grief. He had done that once, and he had watched what it made of him, and he had come back across the impossible threshold of death in time precisely so that he would not have to become that thing again. He thought sometimes of the Baron's nephews, of the brutal beast Rabban who would have been set loose upon Arrakis to squeeze it dry, and of the younger and far more dangerous Fade Rautha, groomed in the Harkonnen fashion to be a blade of exquisite cruelty. In his first life, both had crossed his path, and both had been part of the machinery that ground his family down. Now, Paul watched them from a great and careful distance, and he saw how each of them fit into the Baron's design, and he understood that to undo the design was also, in its gentler way, to spare these men the ruin toward which their master was steering them. He felt no warmth for either of them, but he had learned that a plot undone early harms fewer people than a plot that must be broken by force once it has grown, and that even the guilty are fewer in number when the scheme that made them is quietly starved before it can bear its bitter fruit. And so, quietly, across the seasons of his second life, the great Harkonnen scheme came apart in his patient hands. Not with a blow, not with a blaze, with 100 small and unremarkable turnings, each one loosening the next, until the trap that had once closed upon his family could no longer be made to close at all. The Baron in his distant stronghold still believed himself the spider at the center of the web, still spun his threads and laid his plans, and did not yet understand that the web around him had gone soft and would not hold. That understanding would come to him later, and Paul, watching from the desert, felt no triumph in the thought, only the quiet, steady satisfaction of a mercy done well. Up next in Chapter 15, The Emperor's Gambit Answered, will follow Paul as he turns his patient attention to the Padishah Emperor Shaddam and the hidden Sardaukar, quietly countering a trap laid long in advance by the most powerful man in the universe. Behind the Baron, always, there had been a greater hand, and Paul Atreides had known this even in his first life, though he had learned it too late to matter. The true architect of his family's ruin had never been the fat lord of the Harkonnens alone. It had been the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe, who had grown to fear the rising honor and the growing love that gathered around Duke Leto Atreides, and who had chosen to end that rising by the oldest and coldest of methods. The Emperor had given House Atreides the rich and terrible prize of Arrakis, had smiled as he handed it over, and had arranged, in secret, that the gift would become a grave. This was the gambit that lay beneath all the others, and in his second life, Paul turned his widened eye upon it with a special and careful attention. The Emperor's power did not rest, as the Baron's did, upon appetite and secrets. It rested upon the Sardaukar, the soldier fanatics raised on the prison world of Seleucia Secundus, hardened by a planet that killed the weak and tempered the strong into something very close to the finest fighting force the universe had ever known. In his first life, these hidden soldiers had come to Arrakis disguised in Harkonnen colors, and they had fallen upon his father's house with a ferocity that the Atreides forces, brave as they were, could not have been expected to withstand. The whole trap had turned upon this concealed strength, this army that officially was not there. And Paul understood that to answer the Emperor's gambit, he would have to answer the Sardaukar. He would not do it, this time, by meeting them on a field of open slaughter. He had done that once. He remembered the cost. He remembered how the answering of the Sardaukar had required the raising of the Fremen into a force so fierce and so devout that they had carried his name off Arrakis and out across the stars in a flood of holy war. The Fremen were, he knew without any pride, warriors the equal of the Sardaukar, and perhaps their betters, hardened by a desert crueler than any prison planet. And in his first life he had unleashed them, and could not afterward call them back. So this time he set himself a harder and a quieter task. He would answer the Emperor's hidden strength not by matching fire with greater fire, but by making the fire unnecessary. The heart of the Emperor's gambit was concealment. The whole scheme depended upon the Sardaukar arriving unseen, striking from surprise, and vanishing again into deniability, so that no great house could ever prove that the throne itself had moved against one of its own. Paul understood that surprise was the true weapon, more than the soldiers, and that a trap revealed is a trap already half undone. So across the patient years he worked to gather, quietly and without display, the proof that the throne did not know he possessed. He knew when the Sardaukar would come, and how, and in what borrowed colors, because he had lived it. Knowing this, he could arrange that the coming would be witnessed, recorded, and understood by exactly those parties who most needed to understand it. For there was a delicate architecture to the great powers of the universe, and the Emperor, mighty as he was, did not stand alone at the top of it. There was the Landsraad, the assembly of the great houses, jealous of its ancient rights and terrified, above all, of an emperor who might turn upon any one of them at will. There was the Spacing Guild, whose monopoly on travel between the stars made it the silent partner of every power, and which cared for nothing so much as the uninterrupted flow of the spice, upon which its navigators depended. And there was the Bene Gesserit, Paul's mother's order, patient and deep and playing its own long game across the centuries. Each of these was a counterweight to the throne, and Paul, with his foreknowledge, could set the counterweights in motion before the Emperor ever made his move. He did not need to defeat the Sardaukar in the sand. He needed only to make certain that if they came, their coming could not be hidden, and that the great powers who feared the throne would know, beyond any denial, that Shaddam had reached out in secret to destroy a great house by treachery. An emperor caught in such an act would find the whole delicate structure of his rule turning against him, the Landsraad in fury, the guild uneasy. The balance that kept him upon his throne suddenly and dangerously shifted. Paul understood this balance as few living beings could, for he had once, in his first life, brought the whole of it crashing down through the sheer, overwhelming force of the desert power. Now, he meant to use the balance, rather than break it, to answer the gambit by turning the Emperor's own most dangerous secret into the thing that stayed his hand. There was a further subtlety, and Paul held it carefully. The spice itself was the ground upon which the whole game was played. Arrakis was the only source of melange in all the universe, and melange was the substance without which the Guild could not guide its ships, without which the Bene Gesserit could not reach their deepest sight, without which the Emperor's own vast machinery of rule would grind to a halt. Whoever truly controlled the spice held a hand upon the throat of every power that mattered. In his first life, Paul had grasped this, and had used it as a threat of annihilation, promising to destroy the spice utterly and end the reign of everyone at once. It had worked, and it had been terrible, and it had helped to loose the jihad. This time, he wished to hold the same power without ever having to speak so total a threat. To be known, quietly, as the one who could disturb the spice, and to let that quiet knowledge do the work that in his first life had required an apocalyptic word. He thought, too, of the Emperor's daughter, the Princess Irulan, who in his first life had become a part of the settlement that ended the old order, a bride of state and a chronicler of his legend. She was, he knew, being raised in the Bene Gesserit way, sharp and observant and ambitious for her house, and she stood near the center of the throne's future in ways that even she did not yet fully understand. Paul did not wish to use her as he had once used everyone within his reach, as a piece upon a board. He wished, if it could be managed, to leave her a life of her own choosing rather than fold her into a treaty. This too was part of the gentler answer he was assembling, the patient refusal to spend other people as coin, and it asked of him a restraint that his younger self had never learned to practice. And so, season by season, Paul assembled his answer to the greatest gambit of all, not as a blade drawn, but as a truth prepared. He gathered the witnesses. He steadied the counterweights. He deepened his silent partnership with the desert and its people, so that the Fremen's strength stood ready but leashed, a force the Emperor would have to reckon with, but that Paul would never have to fully unleash. He looked again and again down the branching delta of time, and he watched the channel that led to the throne's defeat grow wider and clearer and gentler, watched the great confrontation that had once ended in a holy fire begin instead to take the shape of something that might be settled with restraint. The Emperor did not know that his hidden hand was already seen. He moved his soldiers into place and believed the trap was his, and Paul, in the deep desert, prepared to answer that trap not with slaughter, but with the simple, devastating fact of having known. Up next, in Chapter 16, A Gentler Path Through the Sand, we'll follow Paul as he weighs the true cost of every mercy, striving to win Arrakis and free the Fremen without the ocean of blood he remembers from the life that came before. Of all the burdens Paul Atreides carried in his second life, the heaviest was not the memory of what he had suffered, but the memory of what he had done. He had, in that first life, won. He had toppled an emperor, mastered the desert, taken the throne of the known universe, and made of himself a figure of such power that his very name became a banner. And behind that banner had marched the jihad, the holy war, the flood of fervor that had carried out from Arrakis and washed across the stars and drowned untold billions in his name. He had seen it coming, even then, and he had not been able to stop it, and now returned to the beginning with all his knowledge intact. The question that governed every choice was a simple and a terrible one. Could he win the desert again and free its people and answer the powers arrayed against him without opening the door to that ocean of blood a second time? He had come to understand, slowly and with much sorrow, that the jihad had not been an accident. It had grown from real things, from the desperate hopes of an oppressed people, from the religious longing that the Bene Gesserit had seeded in the Fremen across long centuries, from Paul's own use of prophecy as a weapon, and above all from the fury of a wronged man who let himself become a Messiah to the ones who needed a Messiah. Each of these had been a stream feeding the flood, and Paul, with his widened eye, could see now how they had joined. To spare the stars the fire, he could not simply refuse the throne. He had to unmake the streams themselves, gently, one by one, without in the process abandoning the very people he had crossed the threshold of death to serve. The Fremen were the heart of it. They were the ones he loved, the fierce and generous people of the deep desert, the ones who had taken him in and taught him the ways of the sand and given him a home and a life. They deserved their freedom. They deserved the green world their dreamer kinds had promised them, the slow terraforming of Arrakis into a place of open water and living things, the end of the long thirst that had shaped every hour of their lives. Paul wanted this for them, with a longing as deep as any he carried. But in his first life, their liberation had come welded to his own ascension, so that the freeing of the Fremen and the crowning of the Messiah had been one single act, and the fervor of the first had powered the horror of the second. Now he labored to pry the two apart, to give the Fremen their freedom without making of himself the God who freed them. This was the work of mercy, and Paul learned, in doing it, that mercy was not soft. Mercy was the hardest thing he had ever attempted. It was easy to win by overwhelming force. He had done that once and knew exactly how. It was easy to let the people make of him a Messiah and to ride their devotion to victory, for that devotion was freely offered and burned very bright. The hard thing, the merciful thing, was to refuse the easy road again and again, to win more slowly and more carefully, to accept smaller victories and greater patience precisely so that the great fire would never catch. Every time he chose the gentler path, he paid for it. He paid in time, in danger, in the frustration of the fierce Fremen who did not always understand why their reborn friend held them back from the swift and total triumph they could feel within their grasp. For the Fremen felt his power, and they wanted to follow it to the ends of the universe. This was the thing Paul had to hold most carefully of all. He could see, whenever he chose to look, the vision of himself raised up as their Mahdi, their prophesied one, the man who would lead them out of bondage in a wave that nothing could resist. The vision was always there, always available, always seductive, because it was the easiest way and the surest way, and the way that answered every enemy at once. And it was the way that ended in the ocean of blood. So Paul made himself small where his younger self had made himself vast. He led without letting himself be worshipped. He guided without letting himself be prophesied. He gave the Fremen victories they could own themselves, rather than miracles that could only be his, so that when Arrakis was at last free, it would be free as their achievement, and not as the first conquest of a holy war. He weighed the cost of every mercy, and the weighing never grew easy. There were moments when the gentler path meant that someone was harmed who might have been saved by a swifter and a harder stroke. There were moments when his restraint let an enemy live who would go on to do wrong, when a single ruthless act would have settled a matter that his patience left dangerously open. Paul did not pretend to himself that the gentle road was free of victims. He had learned in the deepest part of his prescience that no road was free of victims, that mercy itself had a price paid in the coin of those it could not reach. What he held to, through all of it, was the arithmetic he had brought back across the threshold. The knowledge that the ocean of the jihad had drowned more than any local cruelty ever could, and that to prevent that ocean was worth a great deal of nearer and smaller pain, And there was, beneath all the strategy and all the sorrow, a quieter thing that guided him, a thing that had nothing to do with the fate of stars. It was the simple wish to be, this time, a good man. In his first life, he had become something more than a man and something less, a figure of terrible destiny who had watched his own humanity thin away beneath the weight of what he was. He had felt himself becoming an instrument, a force, a thing that history used rather than a person who lived. He had crossed the impossible threshold of death and time not only to spare the universe its fire, but to save his own soul from that slow hollowing, to live, once, as a human being who chose kindness where kindness was possible. The gentler path through the sand was not only a strategy, it was a way of remaining himself. He drew strength in this long labor from those who stood closest to him, the people of Caledon he had brought back from the dead of his own memory. Gurney Halleck, whose loyalty was a fixed star. Duncan Idaho, whose bright courage never dimmed. Thufir Hawat, whose mentat mind he trusted even as he outpaced it. And above all, his mother, the Lady Jessica, who alone came near to guessing the depth of what her son carried, and who had learned to stand beside him without demanding that he lay the whole weight down. These were the ones the jihad had, in his first life, either taken from him or twisted beyond recognition, and to keep them whole and near and living was itself a kind of victory, a proof that the gentler path was not merely a strategy of nations, but a saving of the particular and beloved. So he went on, patiently, through the long work of freeing a world without ruining a galaxy. He gave the desert people the tools and the time to win their own liberation. He answered the Baron's schemes and the Emperor's gambit with restraint rather than wrath. He held the great power of the spice as a quiet certainty rather than a screaming threat. And always he weighed, and always he chose the mercy when the mercy could be borne. And always he watched the branching delta of time to see whether the ocean of blood was receding from the shores of the future. Slowly, channel by channel, it was. The great terrible flood that had once seemed as certain as sunrise was thinning in his visions, giving way to quieter waters, and Paul, walking the sand beneath the enormous patient stars, allowed himself to believe that a gentler ending might truly be within reach. Up next in Chapter 17, Chani and a Life Chosen, will follow Paul into the quiet human center of his vast and cosmic story, into the love relived and the tenderness that grounds all his terrible knowledge in the warmth of a single chosen life. Chapter 17, Chani and a Life Chosen. There is a kind of quiet that only the deep desert knows, and Paul had learned, across 2 lifetimes, to rest inside it. In the hour before dawn, when the great heat of Arrakis had not yet risen, and the stars still held their cold clarity above the open sand, he would lie awake in the sietch and listen to the slow breathing of the woman beside him. Chani slept the way the Fremen slept, lightly and without waste, one hand curled near her crysknife even in the softest dreaming. And Paul had come to love that carefulness in her as much as he loved the fierceness of her waking eyes. He had known her before. He carried the whole of another life within him, every night and every wound of it, and he had lost her once in a future that no longer waited at the end of his road. To have her again, warm and living and near, was a mercy so enormous that he could scarcely hold it without trembling. He had chosen this. That was the thing he returned to, again and again, in the stillness before the light. A man given all the memory of a life already spent, and all the prescient sight that let him wander the branching corridors of what might come, could have chosen almost anything. He could have chosen empire first, or vengeance first, or the cold safety of a future arranged like pieces on a board. Instead, when the moment came in the deep desert of Sietch Tabor, when Chani looked at him without knowing all that he was and simply saw a young man who had crossed the sand and lived, he had let himself be seen. He had let himself be loved as a person and not as a prophet. And he had loved her back as a man and not as a weapon. That, he understood, was the quiet human center that made the rest of the enormous story bearable. She had been his teacher in the small things a second time, and he had never once let on how much he already knew. She showed him again how to fold the still suit tight against the ankle, how to read the wind by the taste of grit on the lip, how to walk without rhythm across the open dune so the great worms would not come. He learned it all as though it were new, and in a way it truly was, for the pleasure of being taught by her was a thing his first life had rushed past too quickly. In that other time, everything had come to him under the pressure of grief and flight. His father dead, his house broken, the desert a refuge won through catastrophe. This time, he had arrived early, patient and prepared, and so the desert had opened to him not as an escape, but as a home, and Chani had been the heart of that home from the first. There were evenings when the Sietch gathered in the great cavern, and the water rings clicked softly in the low light, and Paul would sit at the edge of the warmth and watch her among her people. She moved among the Fremen with an ease he could never quite share, for they were her blood and her land, and he was always, however deeply he was trusted, a man who had come from the green world of water and rain. Yet she had made a bridge for him. She spoke for him when the elders were slow to trust, and she pressed her palm against his chest when the visions took him and left him shaking. And she asked for nothing in return but that he remain honest with her about the weight he carried. He gave her that honesty as far as he dared. He told her that he dreamed of futures. He did not tell her, not for a long while, that in one of those futures she had grieved for him beside a river of the dead. Their child came into that second life as a promise rather than a wound. Paul had held in his memory the terror of an earlier fatherhood shadowed by war, a son endangered by the very fires that his name had lit across the stars. Now, with the jihad held at bay by every patient act of foresight he could manage, the coming of a child felt like a small door opening onto a room full of ordinary light. He would place his hand on the curve of her and feel the flutter beneath, and for once his prescience gave him nothing but the plain animal joy of it, the future for that moment mercifully closed and private. He had spent so much of himself trying to steer the vast machinery of empires away from slaughter that these small, ordinary hopes felt almost illicit, a happiness stolen from a harsher story. Chani understood the shape of him better than anyone living, and better, in some ways, than she could have known. She saw that he grieved for things that had not happened. She saw that he flinched from certain roads, not because they frightened him, but because he remembered walking them. She never demanded the whole of it. She let him keep his silences, and she filled the spaces around them with the practical tenderness of desert life, with shared water and shared work, and the low, steady humor of a people who lived close to death and therefore held tightly to one another. Paul, who had once been made into a messiah by forces he could barely resist, found in her company a way to remain simply himself. A man who had loved a woman and meant to grow old beside her if the sand and the stars would allow it. He knew what his knowledge had cost others to give him this. He knew that every future he had gently turned aside had been a future in which someone else made a different choice, and that the peace he was building rested on a foundation of foresight that no ordinary man could bear. But when he lay beside Chani in the last dark before dawn, he did not feel like the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could be many places at once, the terrible fulcrum of a breeding program centuries in the making. He felt like a young husband, listening to his wife breathe. He felt the ordinary miracle of a single shared life, chosen freely, held gently, and defended with everything he understood about the paths of time. And so, he made her a quiet promise in his own heart, one he never spoke aloud, because speaking it would have made it a prophecy, and he wanted it to remain a hope. He promised that he would not let the future take her. He promised that whatever he had to unwind, whatever schemes he had to blunt, and whatever wars he had to shrink down to something survivable, he would do it so that this life, this small warm center of things, would not be burned away as it had been before. He had all his memories and all his abilities, and he had decided, at last, what they were for. They were not for conquest. They were for this, for her, for the child to come, for a life chosen rather than merely endured. Outside, the first gray line of dawn crept over the sand, and the Sayach began to stir. And Chani opened her eyes and found him already watching her, and did not need to ask why. She only reached up and touched his face, and he closed his eyes and let the day begin. In the vast prescient dark that he alone could see, 10,000 futures still branched and burned. But here, in this one, there was only warmth and water, and the woman he had crossed 2 lifetimes to hold again. Up next in Chapter 18, The Fold of Time, we'll drift into the strange vertigo of living a life already lived, feeling what changes under his careful hands and what stubbornly refuses to change, as memory and prophecy fold quietly into one. Chapter 18, The Fold of Time. To live a life once is to walk forward into darkness, feeling for the ground with every step. To live it a second time, with all the memory of the first intact and all the prescient sight of what may still come, is to walk through a house you have lived in before, in a dream, at night, where some rooms are exactly as you remember, and others have quietly rearranged themselves while your back was turned. This was the strangeness that Paul carried through every waking hour, a soft and constant vertigo, the sense of standing in 2 currents of time at once and being gently pulled by both. There were mornings when he would rise in the Sayach and know, before his eyes were fully open, precisely how the light would fall across the rock, precisely which of the elders would come to him with which small question, precisely the taste of the morning water. Those were the moments when the 2 lives folded so neatly together that he could scarcely tell memory from prophecy. The remembered past and the foreseen future pressed so close that they became a single luminous certainty. In those moments, he moved through the world like a man reciting a poem he had known since childhood, every word landing where it was meant to land. And there was a deep and dangerous comfort in it, the comfort of a road entirely known. But time, he had learned, was not a fixed thing that a man could simply reread like a scroll. It was more like water in the desert, precious and living, and quick to find new channels. Every choice he made pressed against the future and changed its shape, and the changes rippled outward in ways that even his vast sight could not always follow to their end. He had spent his second life learning exactly how much a single patient hand could turn, and exactly how much would not turn no matter how hard he leaned against it. Some things bent easily. A word spoken early to Stilgar, a warning planted in the right ear, a betrayal blunted before it could ripen, and whole tragedies that had once seemed carved in stone dissolved like frost in the sun. Other things refused him. Certain currents ran so deep and so wide that a single man, however gifted, could only nudge them a fraction and watch them close again over the wound he had tried to make. This was the lesson that folded him most tightly between hope and grief. He had believed, in the first flush of his return, that with total memory and total sight he might remake everything. that he might reach back into the machinery of history and reset every gear to spare every life. He had learned instead that history had a kind of terrible inertia, a weight of 10,000 human wills, all pushing in their own directions, and that a prophet who tried to hold all of it still would be crushed beneath it. So, he had become subtle. He had learned to spend his foreknowledge the way a Fremen spent water, drop by careful drop, never wastefully, always toward the futures that mattered most. He had learned that to change one great thing, he must often let 100 small things run their course, and that mercy itself was a resource that could be exhausted. There was a particular vertigo in meeting again the people he had watched die. He would look at a face across the cavern, a warrior who had fallen in his first life beneath the walls of an enemy city, and he would see two men at once, the living one before him and the dead one carried in his memory, and he would have to steady himself against the rock until the doubling passed. He carried a graveyard inside him that no one else could see, populated by people who now walked and breathed and laughed, unaware that their prophet remembered their deaths. It made him tender with them in ways they could not account for. It made him gather them close and study their faces and try, in 100 quiet ways, to write them a different ending than the one he remembered. And there was the deeper fold still, the one that touched his prescience itself. For his gift did not show him a single future, but a vast branching delta of futures, corridors of possibility, opening and closing as choices were made, and the more he changed the past that had been his present, the more those corridors shifted and rearranged. His memory of the first life had once been a reliable map. Now, the further he moved from the events he remembered, the less that map could be trusted, for he was walking off the edge of his own history into territory that no version of him had ever seen. This frightened him more than any enemy. As long as he stayed near the remembered road, he could see clearly. But every mercy he worked, every death he prevented, every scheme he unwound, carried him a little further into the unmapped country where his foresight and his memory no longer agreed. And there he was, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, partly blind. He came to think of it as a fold in a great cloth. In one life, the cloth had lain flat, and the pattern of events had run in a straight and terrible line from the fall of his house to the fire of the jihad. Now he had taken that cloth and folded it back upon itself, so that the boy he had become touched the man he had been, and the fold had created a seam where the 2 times met, a seam full of tension where memory strained against prophecy, and neither could fully win. Along that seam he lived. It was an uncomfortable place, a place of constant small dizziness, but it was also the only place from which the future could be changed at all, and so he had made his peace with the discomfort, as a Fremen makes peace with the heat. What steadied him, in the end, was the discovery that not everything wished to be changed. Some things returned, no matter how he steered, and among them, to his quiet astonishment, were the things he most wanted to keep. Chani had come to him again, though he had done nothing to arrange it. The loyalty of Stilgar had found him again, the wry devotion of the men who trained him, the green memory of Caladan and the sea. It was as though time, for all its terrible inertia, had folded most gently around the things that were most true, so that the love and the loyalty and the belonging survived the reshaping even when the wars and the tragedies did not. He began to suspect that this was the real shape of what he had been given, not the power to erase the past, but the chance to carry its lessons forward and let the good things fold through into the new pattern while the worst of the old was left behind on the far side of the seam. So he lived in the fold, dizzy and watchful and more at peace. He stopped trying to hold all of time still. He learned to move with its currents rather than against them, to spend his foresight on the futures that could still be saved and to release, with grief but without bitterness, the ones that could not. He was a man living his life twice, and he had come to understand that the second living was not a correction of the first, but a kind of answer to it, a slow and deliberate reply written by a wiser hand. Up next, in Chapter 19, The War Without the Jihad, we'll follow him into the final confrontation with Emperor and Guild and great houses, sought this time without the holy fire. A victory shaped by foreknowledge and restraint, rather than by the ocean of blood he once could not prevent. Chapter 19, The War Without the Jihad. In his first life, victory had come to Paul wrapped in fire. He had stood at the last upon the high ground of Arrakis, with a storm at his back and the fervor of the Fremen surging around him like a flood. And he had broken the Padishah Emperor and the assembled might of the great houses. And in the same hour he had felt the holy war uncoil from within his triumph and begin its terrible march across the stars. He had won, and the winning had loosed a jihad that carried his name into slaughter on 100 worlds. He had seen the numbered dead in his visions, the billions, and he had never been able to forgive the road that had led him there. So in this second life, from the very beginning, he had bent every ounce of his foreknowledge toward a single stubborn purpose. He meant to win without the fire. He meant to answer the emperor and the guild and the great houses, and to leave the jihad unlit. He had prepared the ground for years, quietly, the way water works at stone. He had gathered the desert power early, so that when the final reckoning came, the Fremen were not a desperate people flinging themselves upon their oppressors, but a disciplined and confident nation who knew their own strength and did not need to be whipped into a frenzy to use it. He had built his authority among them slowly and honestly, as a man they trusted rather than a messiah they worshipped, and this was the crucial difference. A worshipped man cannot control the flood he unleashes, for the flood belongs to the faith and not to him. A trusted man can ask his people to stay their hand and be heard. Paul had spent 2 lifetimes learning that the difference between a leader and a prophet was the difference between a war that ends and a war that never does. When the confrontation came at last, it came as he had shaped it, on his own terms and in his own time. The Emperor Shaddam IV arrived above Arrakis with his household and his hidden Sardaukar, drawn there, as he had always been drawn, by the failure of the Harkonnens to hold the spice and by the rumor of a desert power he could not name. But this time, there was no shattered House Atreides crying out for vengeance, no orphaned duke's son raised in grief to be the sword of a wronged people. This time, Paul held the strong ground from the start. His father lived, his house endured. The Harkonnen schemes had been unwound thread by patient thread, so that the Baron had fallen without the Fremen ever needing to become an avenging fire. Paul faced the Emperor not as a survivor clawing back what had been taken, but as a sovereign of the desert who had never been broken and therefore had nothing to avenge. The lever remained the same. For some things time would not change. The spice was the pivot of the whole Imperium, the melange without which the Guild could not fold space and the Empire could not hold together. And the spice came only from Arrakis. And Arrakis answered to the Fremen and to the great worms that were the source of it all. Paul held that lever as he had held it before, and the threat he could make was absolute, for he alone had the knowledge and the will to end the spice forever, to destroy the source and darken every road between the stars. In his first life he had made that threat wreathed in prophecy, and it had become a holy thing, and the holiness had spilled over into war. This time he made it coldly and clearly, a matter of power and of consequence, stripped of every mystic robe. He let the guild navigators understand, in their own private terror, that this desert lord could truly do it. He let the emperor understand that the game was already lost, and because he asked for no worship and offered no crusade, the understanding did not catch fire. There was fighting, for foreknowledge is not the same as bloodlessness, and the Sardaukar did not fold their arms and surrender the field. But it was a war contained rather than a war unleashed, a sharp and limited storm rather than an endless conflagration. Paul knew where every blow would fall before it fell, knew the disposition of the emperor's legions, knew the hidden weaknesses in the great shield walls, and the moods of the men who would decide whether to fight or to yield. He spent that knowledge like a surgeon rather than a butcher. He struck where striking would end things quickly, and he stayed his hand wherever mercy could accomplish what slaughter would only have prolonged. The great sandworms answered when he called them, as they had before, and the Fremen rode down out of the storm as they had before. But the purpose that drove them was different, and the difference ran all the way to the marrow of what came after. For the true battle was never the one fought with blades. The true battle was the one fought in the branching corridors of the future, where Paul labored, even in the heat of the final hour, to keep the countless paths from converging upon the single burning road of the jihad. He could feel it there, always, the terrible, easy future in which his victory became a religion, and his religion became an army, and his army became a plague upon the galaxy. It pulled at every choice like gravity. It would have been so simple to let the fervor rise, to let the Fremen name him what they longed to name him, to ride the flood to a throne. He refused it in 1,000 small moments that no historian would ever record. He refused the title when it was offered. He refused the miracle when it was expected. He turned the people's devotion again and again away from worship and toward the ordinary work of building a just peace, and each refusal closed a corridor, and each closed corridor was a world that would not burn. When Shaddam IV at last relinquished the throne, it was not to a Messiah standing knee-deep in the blood of the great houses. It was to a desert sovereign who had won by holding the one thing the empire could not live without, and who now proposed to govern with the same restraint by which he had conquered. Paul took what power he needed and refused the rest. He bound the guild and the Landsraad and the fallen emperor into an arrangement that would hold. An arrangement built not upon terror, but upon the plain, shared understanding that the spice must flow, and that the man who controlled it had chosen, against every temptation, not to be a tyrant. The great houses, who had braced for a fanatic, found instead a ruler who wanted the killing to stop, and they scarcely knew what to make of it, and in their confusion they accepted the peace. And so the thing that Paul had crossed 2 lifetimes to prevent did not come to pass. The jihad, that holy fire he had seen consume the stars, was not lit. The victory was real, and it was his, and it had cost blood, for no such thing is ever wholly clean. But it had not cost the billions. It had not become a crusade. He had answered the emperor and the guild and the great houses with foreknowledge and restraint, and he had left the future, for the first time in either of his lives, open and unburned, and quietly waiting to be lived. Up next in chapter 20, the sleeper who chose his dream will come at last to Paul at rest, the future reshaped and the desert quiet around him, a man who lived his life twice, and, this time, chose peace. Chapter 20, the sleeper who chose his dream. In the end, after the empires had been answered and the great fire left unlit, Paul came back to the quiet. He had begun at a threshold in the deep desert, at the luminous edge where death and prescient vision blur, and he had been offered a return and he had taken it, and he had spent a second whole life spending that gift with all the care a man could summon. Now, at last, the spending was done, and what remained was rest. The desert lay quiet around him. The sand held its warmth into the evening. The stars came out over Arrakis one by one, ancient and patient, and Paul sat among them like a man who has finally set down a weight he had carried so long that he had forgotten it could be set down at all. He thought, in that stillness, of everything the two lives had held. He thought of Caladan, the green ocean world of his childhood, the castle above the water. The cry of the seabirds and the smell of rain, all of it relived a second time and treasured the more for being remembered. He thought of his father, Duke Leto, whose fate he had labored so long and so carefully to change, and of his mother, the Lady Jessica, whose Bene Gesserit teachings he had learned twice over. He thought of Gurney Halleck and his songs and his blade, of Duncan Idaho and his easy courage, of Thufir Hawat and the cold, clean discipline of the Mentat mind. He thought of Stilgar and the trust that had grown between them without disaster to forge it, of Sietch Tabor and the water rings clicking in the low light, of the great worms answering his call across the open sand. He held them all in his mind gently, the living and the once dead alike, and he was grateful. Most of all, he thought of Chani, who slept now in the warmth of the Sietch with their child near, and of the life he had chosen when he could have chosen anything. That was the thread that ran through all of it, the small human center that had made the cosmic story bearable. He had been the Kwisatz Haderach, the terrible fulcrum of 1,000 years of scheming, the one who could stand in many times at once. And he had used all of it, in the end, not to rule the stars, but to protect one warm and ordinary life and the peace that made such lives possible. He did not think it a small thing. He had come to believe it was the largest thing of all. He knew what he had let go. He had learned, across the long fold of the two lives, that not everything could be changed, and that a man who tried to hold all of time still would be broken by it. There were deaths he had prevented and deaths he had not. There were corridors of the future he had closed forever, and corridors he had been forced to leave open, and somewhere in the vast unmapped country beyond his memory, the branching paths still ran on without him. He had made his peace with that. He had stopped trying to be the master of time, and had learned instead to be its careful gardener, tending the futures that could still be saved and releasing, with grief but without bitterness, the ones that could not. It was enough. For the first time in either life, it was enough. He thought of how differently the two lives had ended, and the difference was the whole of what he had crossed the threshold to win. The first life had ended in a kind of blindness, a man walking into the desert alone with the weight of a holy war behind him, and the numbered dead crowded thick around his every thought. The second life ended here, in the open evening, with the people he loved alive around him and the fire never lit. He had not erased the sorrow of the first road. He carried it still, folded quietly into him, a graveyard that only he could see, the memory of every face he had once watched fall. But he had answered that sorrow. He had taken all its lessons and spent them, drop by careful drop, like water in the deep desert, so that this time the ones he loved would live, and the ocean of blood would not rise. A man could ask for nothing more than to be given his grief a second time, and to turn it patiently into mercy. He had seen, in the deepest reaches of the spice trance, the far and awful shape of the golden path, the long, narrow road along which humanity might one day be driven to survive its own vast future. He had glimpsed the terrible choices waiting at the end of that road, the burdens that a later ruler might have to take up so that the species itself would not wither into extinction. He did not know whether that road still lay ahead in this reshaped world, or whether his 2 lifetimes of restraint had unwound even that distant necessity. He had decided, gently, that he did not need to know. He had done what a single man could do. He had bent the near future away from the fire, and he had left the far future open, and he trusted, as much as such a man could trust anything, that others would rise to meet it when the time came. He had carried his portion. He could lay it down. And so, at the end of the second life, Paul Atreides was simply a man at rest in the desert he loved. The prophet had grown quiet. The Kwisatz Haderach had folded his terrible sight closed, like a hand relaxing at last. The visions no longer drove him from sleep, for he had steered the great currents as far as they would go, and there was nothing left that demanded his waking terror. He had lived his life twice, and the second living had been an answer to the first, a slow and deliberate reply written by a wiser and a gentler hand. And the answer was peace. He remembered the threshold where it had all begun, the still luminous place beyond time where he had hung between death and vision and been offered a return. He understood now what he had truly been offered there. Not a chance to conquer, though he could have conquered. Not a chance for vengeance, though vengeance had been within his reach. He had been offered a chance to dream a better dream, and to make of that dream a living world, and he had taken it, and he had spent everything he was to make it real. The sleeper had chosen his dream. He had chosen the green memory over the fire, the love over the crusade, the single warm life over the throne of the stars, and having chosen it, and having built it, and having defended it with all the foresight and all the restraint he possessed, he found at last that he could rest. The desert breathed its slow, warm breath around him. The stars wheeled in their ancient patience overhead. Somewhere in the Sayach, the water rings clicked softly, and Chani turned in her sleep, and the child dreamed its small, untroubled dreams, and the future, reshaped and unburned, lay open and quiet and waiting to be lived. Paul closed his eyes. He let the long vision go. He let the 2 lives fold together one last time into a single steady piece, and he breathed with the breathing of the desert, and he was, after so very long, unafraid. He had lived his life twice. This time, he had chosen its ending, and its ending was rest. Let the sand hold its warmth. Let the stars keep their patient watch. Let the desert be quiet, and the Sayach be still, and the sleeper who chose his dream sink softly now into the deep and gentle dark, where memory and prophecy are folded away, and there is nothing left to steer, and nothing left to fear, and only the slow, warm breathing of a world at peace. Rest now. All is well. All is chosen. All is quiet upon the sand. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight, we followed a threshold in the deep desert and a child who remembered the future, the green world of Caladan before the fall, and the long training taken twice. We watched a trap already seen, an Arrakis foreknown, a traitor named in advance, and a duke who might this time be gently warned. We saw the desert power gathered early, the water of life at Sietch Tabor, the worm and its patient rider, and the terrible vision of a holy war that he tried, with all his knowledge, to steer around. We followed spice and prescience and a wider eye, the Harkonnen undone without an ocean of blood. The Emperor's gambit answered, a gentler path through the sand, and a life chosen quietly beside Chani. Until the fold of time closed over, the war passed without its jihad, and the sleeper chose at last his own soft dream. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer fading from the evening dunes. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.